1,000 years in the dark? Reframing the Middle Ages. History is like a vast cathedral standing silent at night, its towers lost in cloud, its corridors stretching far beyond sight. Some chambers blaze with chandeliers and stained glass, while others lie in shadow, their doors barely opened in today's compilation. We explore one of those long-neglected passages, the 1,000 years often dismissed as the Dark Ages. As stated earlier, certain periods in history appear brilliantly illuminated by constant retelling. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Age of Revolutions. Yet between the fall of Rome and the rise of those brighter ages lies a millennium that later scholars shrouded in gloom. Renaissance humanists, seeking to praise their own brilliance, spoke of the centuries before them as dark, a time they claimed when the light of classical wisdom had gone out. Needless to say, this was less a neutral verdict than a bold attempt at self-promotion. These writers were the self-appointed pilots of a new cultural flight, presenting their world as a dazzling dawn after a long night. By calling earlier centuries dark, they set a flattering record for their own achievements in art, science, and philosophy. But medieval men and women did not walk through life believing themselves ignorant or lost. They prayed, worked, traded, fought and studied. Beneath a sky they considered lit by divine order, not plunged into obscurity behind the label, lay a world of extraordinary variety. In a single village, a peasant might measure the year by sowing and harvest by saints' days, and fairs eating more bread and vegetables than meat, while fearing both crop failure and sudden disease in a nearby town. Merchants counted coins and calculated risk as they sent goods along routes that stretched from chilly northern harbors to the warm markets of the Mediterranean. Above them rose cathedrals whose interiors once blazed with color, rather than bare grey stone in monasteries. Monks traced careful letters by candlelight, copying not only scriptures, but also the words of long-dead Greek and Roman authors, preserving fragments of a much older world. The scriptoria, where they worked, were quieter than any battlefield. Yet the attempt to safeguard knowledge there would shape the intellectual record of Europe for centuries. The flight had been an eventful one, filled with invasions, plagues, and reforms, but never simply blank. This video begins by delving into that contested darkness over the next 2 hours. Interconnected stories unfold. Peasants tied to narrow strips of land, knights testing armor against the brutal reality of war, scholars arguing in the first universities, bankers in crowded Italian streets counting debts, while distant plagues redraw the map of survival. Each tale reveals a shaft of light cutting across the corridor that was once thought unlit. What kind of age produces both soaring cathedrals and mass graves, both banking ledgers and illuminated manuscripts, both rigid faith and daring experiment, from a single forgotten village to imperial courts, from muddy battlefields to silent libraries? Each segment closes on a question that opens the next door, drawing the viewer step by step deeper into the so-called Dark Ages to discover what was really happening in those shadows. Inventing the Dark Ages, how an insult became our default story. History is often lit with spotlights, leaving the rest of the stage in shadow. The so-called Dark Ages are one of those shadows, not because the period itself was empty, but because later spectators dimmed the lights on purpose. The term first took shape in the mind of a disappointed admirer of Rome. In the 14th century, the poet Petrarch stood among crumbling arches and broken statues, convinced that the world had once flown higher. To him, ancient Rome was a vanished golden age, a completed flight of civilization whose records shone with poetry, law, and ordered power. The centuries after Rome's fall appeared, from his vantage point, as a long descent into fog. Broken roads, fractured kingdoms, Latin corrupted, learning scattered. Renaissance humanists who followed repeated this judgment, describing their own era as a rebirth and casting the intervening centuries as a time of darkness, decay, and failed attempts to imitate the ancients. As stated earlier, labels in history rarely remain neutral. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Enlightenment thinkers inherited Petrarch's gloom and sharpened it to a point. Philosophers who spoke of an age of reason needed an age of unreason to stand against. In their story, the medieval world became a caricature. Priests strangling thought, superstition smothering inquiry, violence erupting whenever argument ran out. Against this backdrop, the new rational aviators of science and philosophy could present themselves as solo pilots, breaking through cloud and storm, leaving the medieval past far below. Yet, beneath that dramatic flight path, daily life in the medieval centuries continued with a stubborn, intricate normality. Fields were ploughed, harvests measured, contracts written, and disputes heard in courts that still relied on Roman legal concepts. Trade routes stitched together villages, towns, and distant ports. Merchants carried not only cloth and grain, but news, coins, and stories across Europe and beyond. Monasteries copied texts line by line, preserving not just scripture, but Greek and Roman authors whose works might otherwise have vanished. In Islamic libraries from Cordoba to Baghdad, scholars collected, commented on, and expanded classical learning, creating astronomical tables, medical treatises, and philosophical records that would later re-enter Latin Christendom. Consider a comparison. If some distant future historian judged the modern world only by its wars, genocides, and pandemics, the result would be a very dark chronicle indeed. The flight had been an eventful one. 2 world wars, nuclear weapons, global plagues. Focus only on those, and the picture erases smartphones, vaccines, and probes crossing the outer planets. Labels such as dark or golden flatten the messy reality into a single color, ignoring the strange mixture of terror and ingenuity that marks every age. Needless to say, the persistence of the Dark Ages label tells its own story. In today's compilation, we explore how that insult hardened into habit, echoed in schoolbooks, novels, and films, until it felt natural. The question now is clear. If the term is so misleading, why did it cling so tightly to popular imagination? And what emerges when the light is raised on the actual rhythms of medieval life? Fall of Rome, or just a change of management? If the phrase Dark Ages was a Renaissance insult, the world it tried to erase was the late Roman Empire in slow motion.
History is often imagined as a sudden crash, but here the flight had been an eventful one, descending through clouds long before anyone announced an emergency landing. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the Western Roman Empire still stretched from the misty frontiers of Britain to the sun-baked coasts of North Africa, bound together by roads, taxes, and the distant authority of emperors whose portraits stared from coins. Along those roads moved legions in worn but disciplined ranks, imperial couriers carrying orders, merchants hauling grain and wine, and officials counting every sack. Cities such as Trier, Milan, and Carthage hummed with forums, bathhouses, and law courts where Latin phrases framed arguments and verdicts. A shared imperial identity, endlessly repeated on monuments and in official records, told subjects that they belonged to a single ordered world, guarded by soldiers and sanctified increasingly by Christian bishops in rising basilicas. Yet behind this facade, the structure frayed. The empire's finances strained under military pay, frontier defenses, and the privileges of the rich, who attempted every possible maneuver to escape taxes. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, some reigning for months, others for days, while ambitious generals treated the purple robe as a prize of war. Into this turbulence came migrations and forced movements.
Goths pressing across the Danube, Vandals moving through Gaul and Spain toward North Africa, and other groups testing borders that seemed less solid each year. The sack of Rome by the Goths in 410 sent a shock through the Roman world, yet the city survived, patched and functioning. The more famous fall in 476, when the Germanic commander Odoacer deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus, felt dramatic in retrospect, but at the time was almost bureaucratic. A general dismissing a redundant office. Needless to say, no trumpet sounded to announce that antiquity had ended and the Middle Ages had begun. On the ground, most people stayed exactly where they had always been. Farmers in northern Gaul still walked out to the same fields, watched the same seasons, and counted on the same village shrines and churches. What changed, slowly, were the names and origins of those claiming to rule them. Ostrogothic kings in Italy, Frankish leaders in Gaul, and Visigothic rulers in Spain adopted old Roman titles, minted coins with imperial-style portraits, and employed Roman-trained administrators who knew how to keep tax rolls and legal archives. Historians now speak of successor kingdoms rather than pure collapse. Roman law codes were recopied and adapted, Latin remained the language of administration and Christian worship, and bishops and monasteries inherited many of the empire's bureaucratic habits. At the same time, Germanic customs around warfare, kinship and land blended into this framework, producing hybrid societies where a warrior might swear loyalty on a sword in the morning and hear a sermon in careful Latin by afternoon. In today's compilation, we explore these borderlands between worlds, where fading marble met wooden halls and old imperial eagles hung beside new royal emblems. As stated earlier, the label Dark Ages hides more than it reveals, and here the question sharpens. In this patchwork of successor kingdoms, who actually kept the lights of learning and administration on, and what did ordinary life look like once the empire vanished from the headlines, but not from memory? Inside a medieval village, waking up as a peasant. History is often described as a theater of kings and conquerors, but the real stage under their feet was the village street at dawn. In today's compilation, the camera now drops from palaces and parliaments into a single crooked lane of packed earth, where the story of the so-called Dark Ages begins each morning with smoke, mud, and the sound of roosters. Inside a narrow timber house, walls daubed with clay, the air is already thick. A central hearth smoulders, its smoke curling toward a thatched roof with no chimney to guide it, stinging eyes long before daylight properly arrives. Chickens scratch in one corner, a pig snuffles near the door, and a rough wool blanket separates parents from children on a shared straw mattress. Beyond the thin wall, a neighbor coughs. Beyond that, the parish bell tolls the first note of the day, a slower earthbound version of a town crier's flight through the morning air. Life here runs on a calendar, carved not in marble, but in frost, mud, and dust. As stated earlier, power in this world is layered, but for a peasant, the most immediate authority is the season. In spring, the common fields demand ploughing and sowing, a coordinated attempt to coax grain from heavy soil before the rains shift. Summer stretches into long days of weeding, haymaking, and tending animals on rough pasture. Autumn is a race against failing light, cutting and gathering every stalk that might stand between the village and hunger. Winter slows the body, but not obligations. Tools are mended by the fire, animals are fed from dwindling stores, and the Lord's dues still arrive, even when the ground is iron. Food reflects this rhythm with brutal clarity. Bread, often dark and coarse, forms the center of most meals, its quality a living record of harvest success or failure. Porridge made from oats or barley thickens the morning,
while onions, leeks, and cabbages from small garden plots provide what color the plate can manage. Meat appears rarely, perhaps a salted herring from distant coasts, a scrap of bacon on holy days, or a slaughtered animal when disease or age forces the issue. Ale, weak but vital, is safer than much of the water, an everyday drink that turns grain into something the body can trust. Around this diet turns a dense social orbit. Fields are worked in strips, interlaced so that every household's fortune is tied to its neighbors. Obligations to the Lord shape the week, days of labor on his domain land, rents in grain or eggs, small rituals of deference at the manor gate. Yet the parish church, standing slightly apart, gathers more than tithes. It collects fears, hopes, and the latest gossip about births, scandals, and wandering preachers whose words attempt a solo flight above ordinary anxiety. The village world appears small. Most inhabitants may never travel beyond a few miles from the church door. Needless to say, that does not protect it. Royal tax demands, passing armies, or the sudden arrival of plague can crash through this fragile order without warning, turning a quiet harvest into a desperate attempt at survival. In today's compilation, this tension between narrow horizons and extraordinary intrusion becomes crucial, because the next chapter follows what happens when war, faith, and disease begin to test how much strain this local universe can bear. Feasts, fasts, and saints' days, the medieval calendar of life. If war and plague crashed through the village like sudden storms, the quieter rhythm of most years was set by something far more predictable: the turning pages of the church's calendar. Time itself was not merely counted in days and months, but in a flight of feasts and fasts, saints' days and vigils, each one promising either relief from toil or a new burden of restraint. In today's compilation, this calendar becomes another kind of map, charting how ordinary people moved between work, worship, and celebration. The week might be ruled by plough and pasture, yet the year was punctuated by holy days when labor legally stopped and the village became a congregation in motion. Candlemas in the cold of February, Corpus Christi in early summer, the feast of the village's own patron saint. Each offered processions through muddy lanes, bells pealing, banners unfurled, and a rare chance to see neighbors not bent double in the fields, but walking, singing, and watching the same extraordinary spectacle. Among these days, Christmas and Easter towered over the rest. Christmas, set against the deep winter, brought the longest pauses from agricultural work, with special breads, spiced ale where it could be afforded, and the telling of stories by firelight that braided biblical scenes with local legend. Easter, arriving with spring, was more tightly choreographed, days of solemn ritual, then an explosion of color, incense, and song. After the long Lenten fast, the first mouthful of meat or rich dairy tasted not only of fat and salt, but of victory, the successful completion of a difficult attempt at collective self-denial. Around harvest, the calendar met the land even more directly. Lammas, the loaf mass, marked the first bread from new grain, carried to the altar in procession before it ever reached a table. Later, harvest celebrations, though technically pious thanksgivings, might blur into something rowdier. Records hint at games, wrestling, mock battles, and drinking that pushed the boundaries of clerical patience. Needless to say, not every priest succeeded in keeping devotion and disorder neatly separated. Yet the same system that licensed feasting also imposed fasting. Lent before Easter and Advent before Christmas were only the most prominent of many periods when meat was forbidden and meals curtailed. On Fridays, on vigils of major feasts, on dozens of saints' days, the diet shifted toward grains, vegetables, and above all, fish. This created its own form of ingenuity.
In coastal regions, herring and cod became staples. Inland, preserved or river fish did the work. There were even creative fish dishes that stretched the definition, from almond-based imitations to recipes where beaver tail or barnacle goose were argued with a straight face to count as aquatic. As stated earlier, this world was anything but simple. The liturgical year overlaid far older seasonal knowledge, sowing and reaping, the danger of a late frost, the hope carried by a mild spring. Christian symbolism wrapped itself around these cycles, turning the return of light after winter into nativity, the greening of fields into resurrection, the anxiety of harvest into a formal thanksgiving. The flight had been an eventful one, from pagan observances to Christian feasts, and traces of that older past still flickered in bonfires, charms, and processions whose meanings were only half understood. Behind all of this lay a final question. Who decided that this day was for feasting, that one for fasting, and another for a particular saint whose bones were said to rest in a distant shrine? To answer that, the story must leave the village lanes and climb toward the towering institutions that claimed authority over time itself, from the local parish church to monasteries, bishops, and a distant papal court where the calendar of an entire world could be revised with a single decree. From mud huts to stone towers, lords, manors, and power. If the parish church measured time in bells and saints' days, the manor measured it in plough furrows and harvests. History in this period did not unfold first in royal palaces, but in the tight orbit between a village and the lord who claimed its fields, woods, and rivers as a single living estate. This arrangement, known to historians as manorialism, rested on a stark but comprehensible bargain. Peasants, whether technically free or bound as serfs, received access to strips of arable land, shared meadows, and the lord's mill or oven. In return, they owed labor on the lord's own domain fields, rents in grain or coin, and a share of produce from their animals and gardens. The flight had been an eventful one, from older Roman tax systems to this web of personal obligations, but the result was clear. Survival depended on accepting a place in a local hierarchy that promised protection, however unevenly delivered. The manor itself formed a compact world. At its center rose the Lord's Hall, or modest stone tower, a far cry from the vast castles of legend, yet still an extraordinary symbol of authority against a horizon of mud huts and timber cottages. Around it clustered barns heavy with sheaves of wheat and rye, byres for cattle and pigs, and the indispensable mill, whose turning wheel translated water or wind into ground flour. Beyond lay the great open fields, divided into long, narrow strips. Each family worked scattered pieces here and there, an arrangement that bound neighbors together in both cooperation and resentment. Justice, as stated earlier for the calendar, was not an abstract principle handed down from distant capitals, but a local performance. Manorial courts met in the hall or under a spreading tree, where the lord or his steward presided over quarrels about hedges, grazing rights, broken ploughs, and insults shouted after too much ale. Fines in coin, grain, or labor reinforced rank, yet they also created a recognizable record of expectations. In today's compilation, this small arena of judgment shows how order could emerge from repeated, almost ritual attempts to settle disputes before they turned violent. Needless to say, the system could be harsh. Corvée labor might pull peasants away from their own fields at the worst possible moment, and arbitrary demands for extra payments, military service, or hospitality weighed heavily. Yet for many families, the manor was the entire known world, its boundaries rarely crossed, its patterns of sowing, reaping, and worship repeated across generations. Within that narrow horizon, a measure of stability existed. even as plagues, wars, and failed harvests periodically shattered it. As these local lords tightened their grip, another authority quietly claimed a far greater jurisdiction, not just over fields and rivers, but over every soul in Christendom. The next part of this story turns from the manor court to an institution that spoke in Latin, counted time in centuries, and asserted the power to open and close the very gates of heaven. The church that ruled time, parish, priest, and pope. History is often described as a cathedral of memory, its arches formed by laws, wars, and dynasties. Yet in today's compilation, the next part of the story unfolds not in a royal hall, but in a small stone building at the center of almost every village, the parish church. The architecture was modest by later standards, thick walls of rough masonry, a narrow doorway sometimes carved with saints, a wooden roof darkened by smoke, and, if the community had the means, a squat tower for a single bell. That bell measured out the flight of each day, calling workers from fields to mass, tolling for the dead, pealing for feast days. Inside, the ritual calendar structured an entire life. Baptism at the font marked arrival in the Christian world. Marriage at the chancel rail made unions legal and sacred. Confession whispered in a corner promised forgiveness, and at the end, burial in consecrated ground tied the body to that patch of earth forever. At the center of this routine stood the village priest. In theory, he served as mediator between humanity and God, lifting bread and wine at the altar in a mystery that peasants might not fully grasp, but deeply feared to miss. In practice, he was also a crucial local official. He recorded agreements and land transfers when most could not write, read letters for those with business beyond the village, and in some places attempted to teach a handful of children the Latin words that unlocked scripture and law. As stated earlier about other forms of authority, his power could be distant and abstract, yet here it was immediate, spoken in the same dialect, sharing the same weather and harvest. From that small circle of light, the hierarchy expanded outward. Parish priests answered to bishops, whose cathedrals dominated regional towns, their spires proclaiming both spiritual and political reach. Above them stood archbishops, guardians of larger provinces. And, at the summit, the Pope in Rome, claiming jurisdiction over every Christian soul and, at times, over kings and emperors as well. In today's compilation, this vertical chain resembles an invisible ladder, running from a muddy churchyard to marble halls, where disputes over doctrine, marriage and war were argued in Latin before men who rarely saw a plough. The system also moved wealth upward. Tithes, traditionally a tenth of produce, flowed from fields as sacks of grain, kegs of ale and coins, supporting the parish, then the bishop's household, then distant projects. Those offerings helped fund grand cathedrals, whose stained glass retold sacred stories, monasteries where manuscripts preserved Greek and Roman texts, and charitable works for the sick and poor. Yet the same river of resources bred resentment when a hungry village watched fine vestments and new stonework rise while its own roofs leaked. Then a pattern interrupt. Imagine a quiet Sunday Mass in a tiny chapel. A handful of voices chanting, smoke from cheap tallow candles. A priest in a patched surplice raising the host in near silence. Now set that against the roaring crowds of a papal coronation in Rome, trumpets blaring, nobles in embroidered cloaks, banners snapping above armored guards. Here, the head of the church blessed emperors, settled dynastic disputes, and turned spiritual authority into open political theatre. Needless to say, such ceremonies did not always please the rulers who knelt to receive that blessing, and the stage was set for future confrontations, where altar and throne would struggle to pilot the same world. The flight had been an eventful one already, from manor courts to parish bells to the papal tiara.
The next section of this story turns to those who lived slightly apart from both castle and village, in cloisters and scriptoria, attempting a different record of time and truth. Silent scribes, monasteries that saved a civilization. History is often imagined as a battlefield of kings and crusaders, but another campaign unfolded in near silence, fought not with swords but with ink. In today's compilation, the story turns inward, behind stone walls, where an attempt was made to pilot memory itself through an age later branded as dark. A medieval monastery formed a small, ordered world. Beyond its gate stretched fields and orchards. Within, cloister walks framed a square of grass, dormitories lined with hard beds, a refectory where meals were eaten in silence while a single reader intoned a text. At the center of this world stood the church. Beside it, often less noticed in popular history, lay the scriptorium. This was the workshop of words, a long, bright room when candles allowed, where robed figures bent over desks, transforming animal skin into pages and pages, into a record of civilization. The labor of a scribe was both spiritual exercise and physical ordeal. Hours passed in absolute concentration. Letters formed with almost mechanical precision. Any slip a potential disaster on parchment that might cost the equivalent of a small farm. Ink could freeze, candles gutter, fingers cramp, yet the line must continue. A single large Bible could require hundreds of calfskins and months of continuous effort. Needless to say, in a world where most people never owned so much as a scrap of writing, one complete book could be worth more than a townhouse, its presence in a monastery treasury guarded as carefully as relics of the saints. Contrary to the later myth of unrelieved ignorance, those pages did not contain scripture alone. Monastic libraries preserved and recopied the words of Cicero and Virgil, the philosophical flights of Plato and Aristotle, the medical treatises of Galen. As stated earlier, the term Dark Ages was largely a Renaissance invention, and nowhere is that clearer than in these quiet rooms where classical authors survived their own empires. A Carolingian monk at Rheims or Tours might labor over a speech by a Roman senator one day and a commentary on the Gospels the next, treating both as part of a single, continuous story about the world and its order. Certain houses became renowned waypoints in this intellectual flight. Monte Cassino, founded by Benedict, rose, fell to war, and rose again as a beacon of law and learning. Cluny, backed by aristocratic patrons, sent out reformed priories across Europe, carrying not only liturgical customs, but also books. Far to the northwest, Irish monasteries on wind-beaten coasts trained scholarly pilgrims who traveled as spiritual aviators of the mind, bearing manuscripts into the Frankish kingdoms and beyond. From these centers, script and scholarship radiated outward, seeding cathedral schools and, eventually, the first universities. The flight had been an eventful one already, but it balanced on a knife edge. Many ancient works survive today in a single medieval copy, made in some half-heated room under a leaking roof. Imagine an alternate timeline where one inattentive sacristan let the lamp burn too low, one lightning strike found a library roof, and that lone manuscript of a scientific tract or philosophical dialogue turned to smoke. How different might modern physics, political theory, or even poetry be if a nameless scribe's night of work had never happened? Charlemagne, the warlord who crowned himself a scholar. If a single manuscript could tilt the course of history, what about a single man who tried to reorder an entire continent? From those dimly lit scriptoria, the focus shifts to a figure whose life was one long campaign, and yet whose legacy rests as much on parchment as on the sword. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, warlord, and unlikely patron of learning. In today's compilation, we explore how a ruler born into a patchwork of territories
turned relentless warfare into a strange kind of order. When Charlemagne inherited the Frankish throne in 768, his world was a mosaic of small kingdoms, tribal regions, and fading Roman memories. He spent the next 4 decades in near-constant campaign against the Lombards in Italy, the Saxons in the forests of the north, the Avars beyond the Alps, even a disastrous attempt to push into Muslim Spain that ended with an ambush at Roncesvalles. The flight of his armies across rivers and mountain passes created an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to Central Europe. This story reached a symbolic climax in Rome on Christmas Day, 800. As stated earlier, titles in history can matter as much as armies. During a solemn mass in St. Peter's, the Pope suddenly placed a crown upon Charlemagne's head and hailed him as Emperor of the Romans. In that instant, the idea of a Western Roman Empire, extinguished 3 centuries before, seemed to flare back to life under a Germanic ruler who spoke a Frankish tongue. The record of that day shows Charlemagne later claimed surprise, yet the message was clear. A new pilot had taken the controls of the old imperial flight. Yet this conqueror did something unexpected. Instead of resting on military glory, he turned inward towards schools, books, and language. Historians call the result the Carolingian Renaissance. At his palace at Aachen, Charlemagne gathered scholars from across the Christian world, among them Alcuin of York, an English cleric who became his chief intellectual advisor. Together they pushed for standardized Latin so that priests from Spain to Saxony could understand the same prayers, ordered cathedral and monastic schools to train clergy, and encouraged the copying of texts from church fathers to fragments of Roman poetry. Needless to say, there was a deep irony at the heart of this program. Charlemagne himself may have been illiterate or at best semi-literate, a ruler who reportedly slept with wax tablets under his pillow, practicing letters he never fully mastered. Yet under his command script was reformed into the clear, rounded Carolingian minuscule, a hand so legible that modern lowercase printing still echoes it. The survival of countless classical works depends on copies made in his realm by monks who never saw a battlefield, but who, in their own way, fought against oblivion. The flight had been an eventful one, but empires built on a single extraordinary aviator rarely cruise for long. After Charlemagne's death in 814, his grand realm fractured under his heirs, torn by civil war, raids, and local ambition. How did this brief burst of order and learning echo through the chaos that followed, and what traces of his vanished empire still shape the world centuries later? Vikings at the door. Raids, rivers, and reinvention. If Charlemagne's empire had been a brief, disciplined flight through clear skies, the 9th century soon resembled a coastline braced for a storm. Order fractured inland, and along the misty edges of the North Sea and Atlantic, new silhouettes appeared. Long, low ships with dragon heads and striped sails cutting through grey water at dawn. On a rocky shore in Northumbria, a monastery wakes to the ordinary rhythm of prayer and copying manuscripts. The air smells of salt and damp wool. Monks shuffle toward the chapel, clutching candles against the wind. Then a shout from the watchman, the sudden clatter of feet, the sight that would burn itself into memory and record. Longships knifing toward the beach, oars rising and falling in perfect, terrifying unison. Within minutes, doors are smashed, altars stripped, gold and silver chalices seized. Books that took years to copy are hurled into the mud. The raiders vanish as quickly as they arrived, leaving smoke, blood, and questions about where such men had come from and why. In today's compilation, this is not a random outburst of cruelty, but part of a wider story. In Scandinavia, population pressures strained farmland, while shifting political alliances pushed ambitious leaders to seek wealth abroad. Crucially,
Clinker-built ships with shallow drafts allowed Norse crews to attempt something extraordinary. Not only coastal strikes, but sudden thrusts up rivers deep into the continent. A fragmented Europe, as stated earlier, meant rich monasteries and towns, lightly defended and filled with portable treasure, lay almost invitingly along these watery highways. Yet the figure of the Viking as a permanent, howling invader tells only part of the tale. As the decades passed, those same longships carried traders as well as warriors, their cargo holds filled with furs, amber, slaves, and silver. The flight had been an eventful one from raiding to settlement. On the Irish Sea, Norse warbands carved out bases that grew into towns such as Dublin, a hub for trade and human misery alike. Along the Seine, a chieftain named Rollo accepted land from the Frankish king, becoming the first ruler of Normandy. His descendants would one day cross the Channel as conquerors, thoroughly entangled with the very aristocracies once terrorized. Needless to say, this proximity produced exchange as well as fear. Norse words seeped into Old English and French, leaving traces in everyday speech. New trade routes stitched the North Atlantic world to the markets of the Baltic and beyond. Over time, missionaries followed the merchants. Viking leaders accepted baptism, sometimes for conviction, sometimes for politics, raising churches where their grandfathers had toppled crosses. Here the pattern interrupts itself. Return to that Northumbrian shore, not in smoke and panic, but in the soft light of an 11th century afternoon. A nobleman oversees masons setting the foundations of a stone church overlooking the same grey sea. His grandfather once stood in a longship, axe in hand. He stands robed in Christian finery, a patron of saints and scribes. Monks chant in a tongue laced with Norse loanwords, praying for the soul of a benefactor whose ancestors burned predecessors of this very place. History, in this quiet moment, does not erase violence. It folds it into a new order. From such collisions of fear, profit, and faith, medieval Europe learned to rebuild on different terms. Beyond the coasts and river mouths, inland villages and lords adapted as well, reshaping everyday life in ways that would slowly edge the continent toward the world that followed. Forging feudalism, knights, oaths, and fragmented kingdoms. From those inland experiments in survival, power began to fracture in earnest. History is often imagined as a neat line of empires rising and falling, but post-Carolingian Europe resembled a shattered mirror, countless small reflections of authority, none strong enough to dominate the whole. When Charlemagne's grand empire broke apart under his heirs, borders blurred, cousins quarreled, and ambitious counts and warlords treated royal territories as personal prizes rather than sacred trusts. In today's compilation, The Flight of Time carries the story from imperial court to local stronghold. Along the Rhine, in northern Italy, in the patchwork of what would one day be France, men who could command armed followers carved out pockets of control. Their power rested less on parchment and more on the capacity to summon violence at short notice. Viking raids, Magyar incursions, and rival lords made conflict frequent, sometimes seasonal, almost routine. In this world, slow infantry alone could not answer fast-moving threats. The mounted warrior became the decisive instrument, the human equivalent of a swift, heavily armed ship cutting through a crowded harbor. To sustain such specialists required a new pattern of obligation. As stated earlier, historians use the word feudalism as a convenient shorthand, though the reality on the ground was far from tidy. At its core lay personal bonds of loyalty, sealed not by abstract patriotism, but by spoken oaths, handclasps, and ritual gestures performed before witnesses and the church.
A lord granted land, or the income from it, known as a fief. In return, the recipient promised military service, counsel, and support, creating a web of mutual expectation that bound countryside to castle. This was less a clean hierarchy than a tangle of overlapping ties. A single noble might hold fiefs from several greater lords, each expecting service, each imagining priority. Needless to say, such arrangements generated endless disputes, shifting alliances, and legal quarrels that would occupy generations of clerks and chroniclers. Yet these same bonds stabilized local rule just enough for fields to be sown, rents to be collected, and parishes to function under the distant blessing of kings who often controlled little beyond their own traveling households. At the center of this evolving order stood the knight. Far from the effortless hero of later romance, the early knight was a costly military specialist. A proper warhorse could equal the value of a small farm. Armor, weapons, and years of training formed an investment that only substantial landholding could sustain. To be able to mount in mail and charge with a couched lance was not simply a skill, it was a social statement. This rider owned, or was granted, the means of organized violence. Many of these men were closer to armed enforcers than to polished courtiers. Contemporary complaints describe them extorting peasants, burning rival villages, and turning religious festivals into opportunities for feud and plunder. The later language of chivalry, honor, mercy, defense of the weak, emerged in part as an attempt by clergy and monarchs to discipline this rough cavalry, to turn unpredictable thugs into something approaching guardians of an emerging order. The flight had been an eventful one, from pragmatic oaths to idealized codes, from scattered war bands to a knightly class that would dominate the imagination of Europe. In the modern world, the knight is often remembered as a gleaming figure framed by trumpets and banners. Yet what did a real medieval battle feel like from the ground, amid mud, blood, and splintered lances? And how far did that brutal reality stand from the shining armor fantasy that later centuries would record and celebrate? Castles and sieges. The real business of medieval war history is often remembered as a succession of charges and clashes, a restless flight from one battlefield to the next. Yet in today's compilation, the real business of medieval war unfolds not in open fields beneath streaming banners, but around cold walls of stone that refuse to move. After the first waves of conquest, lords began by delving into simpler defenses. Wooden motte and bailey forts, perched on artificial mounds with a palisade on top and a bailey below. These early strongholds went up quickly and burned just as fast. Fire, that oldest of weapons, could undo months of labor in a single night. As ambitions expanded and resources deepened, timber gave way to stone. Great keeps rose, flanked by curtain walls, towers and gatehouses, often ringed with ditches or moats that turned the castle into a small fortified world. These were not only fortresses but headquarters. Within those walls sat the Lord's Hall, storerooms, chapels, and administrative chambers, where rents were counted, disputes judged, and charters sealed. A castle recorded power on the landscape as clearly as any written document. Controlling one meant controlling the surrounding fields, roads, and villages. Losing one could unravel an entire region's political order. As stated earlier, tales of knights in full armor thundering across fields have dominated later memory. Yet most campaigns turned on slower, harsher attempts to crack these stone shells. Armies marched not so much to seek a decisive clash as to isolate a stronghold and wait. Siege warfare meant starving out garrisons, cutting supply lines, and probing for weak points where sappers could tunnel under foundations and bring walls crashing down. Negotiation hovered over every attempt. A commander weighed the cost of a storming assault against the promise of honorable surrender ransom, and the preservation of valuable property. The sensory reality of such an attempt was far from heroic. Outside the walls, thousands of men and animals crowded into makeshift camps. Latrines overflowed, refuse piled up, and disease spread through ranks that spent weeks in mud and smoke. Inside, defenders rationed grain, watered wine, and watched panic rise as wells ran low and the smell of unwashed bodies thickened in cramped courtyards. Trumpets, drums, and shouted threats became tools of psychological warfare, joined by grim displays, executed prisoners hung where everyone could see, or stones from mangonels smashing roofs and chapels that had once felt safe. Needless to say, courage mattered, but logistics often decided who endured. Pay had to arrive on time. Fodder for horses and food for men had to cross dangerous roads. Alliances and credit networks had to hold. A brilliant solo charge by a renowned pilot of the lance meant little if the army's bread ran out or a creditor refused to extend one more loan. In this world, the most extraordinary victories were sometimes quiet. A garrison slipping away at night, a besieger forced to lift camp by hunger rather than by defeat in open battle. Yet even as lords contested walls and fields in this brutal, methodical fashion, another record of knighthood was being drafted in courts and monasteries, an attempt to turn hard-edged fighters into paragons of Christian virtue, and that attempt would change what war was supposed to mean. Chivalry and courtly, love, how to civilize a knight. That second record of knighthood did not appear on blood-spattered shields or broken lances, but on parchment in sermons, poems, and law codes. In today's compilation of medieval stories, this quieter flight of the imagination is just as important as any charge across a battlefield. Churchmen and court poets began to sketch an extraordinary ideal: the knight as guardian of the weak, loyal servant of his lord, and disciplined soldier of Christ. Bishops who had watched mercenaries burn villages now preached that a true warrior defended widows and orphans, respected churches, and obeyed the peace of God, those solemn oaths that tried to limit when and whom a sword could touch. Monastic writers praised rulers who protected pilgrims rather than plundering them. It was, in effect, an attempt to pilot raw aggression into a narrow corridor, to turn mounted raiders into something closer to a religious order with spurs. Needless to say, this was as much aspiration as description. Around the same courts, another invention took flight: the culture of courtly love. Troubadours in southern France, and later across Europe, sang of distant, often married ladies, adored from afar by knights who vowed service, secrecy, and perfect manners. Their songs spoke of sleepless nights, exquisite emotional suffering, and gestures as small as a glance or a dropped glove, all set against a world where real armor clanged and real bones broke. The contrast between the polished verses and the brutal fields of battle could hardly be sharper. These poems and romances did more than entertain. As stated earlier in this series, stories in history often function as quiet laws, and here they offered a script for elite behavior. A knight who wanted favor at court now had to attempt not only courage, but elegant speech, controlled anger, and public piety. Tournaments with their colorful banners, heralds' cries, and carefully staged encounters channeled violence into a kind of ritualized sport, a rehearsal for war that also displayed loyalty to princes, and increasingly to grand causes such as crusades. For a moment, imagine that tournament in full brightness: painted shields, horses caparisoned in vivid cloth, a lord's daughter watching from a balcony, while a favored champion rides out, dedicating his performance to her in elaborate phrases. Then the pattern breaks. Cut abruptly to a muddy village after that same heroic army has marched through. Trampled fields, doors smashed, a mother searching for a missing child, the smoke of hastily burned hayricks still hanging in the air. This too is chivalry's world. The ideals of courtly love praised women as wise, pure, and almost sacred. In practice, their legal rights over land, marriage, or their own bodies often lagged far behind the poetry. Knights still pillaged, peasants still suffered, and even crusades, framed as holy flights of devotion, brought massacres as well as miracles. Yet these stories of the perfect knight and unattainable lady endured, giving Europe's elites a shared language and setting the stage for new attempts to reform power in the centuries ahead. Women in the Middle Ages. Between cloister, cottage, and court. The elegant verses of courtly love floated above a far harsher ground. Beneath the balconies and painted halls, medieval women moved through cloister, cottage, and court, their lives tracing the real boundaries of power in a world that preached female obedience, yet relied on their labor at every turn. In today's compilation, we explore those lives beginning in the village, where most stories in this period unfolded. Peasant women rose with the light, walking out to the strips of open field land to sow, weed, and harvest beside husbands, fathers, or employers. The flight had been an eventful one for the year's grain, and their hands were on every stage of it, gleaning fallen ears after reaping, threshing and winnowing, grinding at hand mills when the Lord's mill was too costly. Back at the cottage, they managed households that were workshops as much as homes, brewing ale in great tubs, salting and smoking what meat could be afforded, turning wool and flax into thread, cloth, and clothing. Child rearing was constant, but it did not happen in isolation. Neighbors shared midwives, gossip, remedies, and emergency childcare, creating dense community networks in which women carried news, arranged informal credit, and sometimes testified in village courts. As stated earlier, written law tended to favor male authority, yet in practice, widows might hold small plots, run market stalls, or even defend their rights before a manor court, their voices recorded in terse Latin phrases that still survive. Higher up the social ladder, noblewomen moved in stone halls and fortified castles, but their responsibilities were no less demanding. When lords rode off to fight or to serve at a royal court, wives might effectively pilot entire estates, overseeing stewards, ordering repairs, ensuring rents and dues arrived on schedule, and keeping meticulous account rolls that modern historians treat as a kind of economic flight record for the Middle Ages. Marriage arrangements passed through their hands as well, as mothers negotiated dowries, fostered alliances, and sometimes steered younger relatives toward convent or court, depending on opportunity. In moments of crisis, some noblewomen became political actors in their own right. Regents ruled for underage sons, negotiated with rival factions, and authorized military attempts to hold or seize power. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Duchess in her own name, Queen of both France and England in succession, moved across this world with extraordinary freedom, sponsoring troubadours, joining a crusading expedition, and later backing her sons in rebellion against their father. Her story marks the upper limits of what birth, wealth, and sheer force of character could achieve for a woman in a rigidly patriarchal society. Beyond marriage and lordship lay the cloister. Monasteries and convents dotted the European landscape, and for some women, the veil offered an alternative path. Nuns might live under strict enclosure, yet abbesses could command significant spiritual and economic authority, managing lands, collecting rents, and corresponding with bishops, princes, and even popes. In these houses, books were copied, music composed, and visions recorded. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess on the Rhine, stands out as a singular figure. Claimed visions from childhood
became the foundation for dense theological works, letters of admonition to emperors, and soaring compositions that still echo in modern performances. She wrote on medicine and nature, interpreted dreams, and supervised a community of women whose learning quietly contradicted the notion that the so-called Dark Ages were entirely devoid of intellectual light. Needless to say, such figures were exceptional, and most women lived within strict limits of law, custom, and physical danger. Yet across classes, their work underpinned agriculture, household survival, religious practice, and dynastic politics. In a world where many people never traveled more than a few miles from home, that might have been the entire horizon of expectation. Soon, however, new calls would pierce that horizon. Preachers and princes would urge men, and sometimes women, to leave fields, workshops, and cloisters behind and march thousands of miles toward an imagined holy city. The next stage of this history would not be a quest for trade or exploration, but an armed pilgrimage, the age of crusade. The First Crusade, when Europe marched east for heaven. History is often imagined as a straight road, but at Clermont in 1095 it suddenly reared up, turned east, and promised heaven at the end of the track. In today's compilation, this armed pilgrimage becomes one of the most consequential flights of imagination in the medieval world. At the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II addressed assembled bishops, lords, and hard-bitten knights. Reports had arrived from the Byzantine Emperor, Alexios Komnenos, pleading for help against advancing Turkish forces. Urban did far more than promise military aid. He framed the journey as a holy expedition, urging warriors to take up the cross, sew its emblem onto cloak or tunic, and march to aid Eastern Christians and reclaim Jerusalem. For those who went, he promised remission of sins, a spiritual clean slate written over a record of violence. As stated earlier, medieval Europe breathed religion, yet the motives that answered this call were anything but simple. Some were genuinely pious, convinced that an armed pilgrimage might save their souls and secure a place in paradise. Others saw a rare attempt to win land in a crowded feudal landscape or to seize booty from wealthy eastern cities. Younger sons without inheritance, minor lords drowning in debt, and restless bands of retainers heard the same sermon and imagined different rewards. Churchmen around Urban also hoped to redirect the constant feuding of Christian knights outward, away from villages and monasteries, and toward enemies defined as infidels. The flight had been an eventful one, long before the first Crusaders glimpsed the walls of Jerusalem. Bands from France, the German lands, and Italy trudged thousands of miles on foot, starving, deserting, and occasionally massacring Jewish communities along the Rhine in eruptions of apocalyptic fury. By the time the main armies reached the great fortress city of Antioch, hunger and disease had already thinned their ranks. The siege dragged on for months. At one point, the Crusaders themselves were besieged inside the captured city, clinging to rumors of holy lances and visions of saintly cavalry riding to their aid. In 1099, the survivors reached Jerusalem. What followed has haunted history. After a brutal siege, Crusaders stormed the city and slaughtered its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants in scenes even some contemporaries found beyond belief. Chroniclers boasted of streets running with blood, an extraordinary collision of sacred rhetoric and unrestrained killing that still shapes the memory of the First Crusade. From these conquests emerged fragile Crusader states, Latin Christian enclaves at Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Western lords became Eastern princes, ruling over mixed populations of Greek and Armenian Christians, Muslims and Jews, negotiating and fighting with neighboring powers such as the Fatimid Caliphate and Seljuk Emirates. Needless to say, these small states
tied Europe into Eastern Mediterranean politics for generations. Yet while mail-clad knights carved out lordships in the Levant, quieter forces were also on the move. Spices, sugar, medical texts, navigational ideas, and unfamiliar diseases crossed the same routes as pilgrims and soldiers, seeding changes in diet, medicine, trade, and even city life back in Europe. The crusade had been preached as a road to heaven. Its unintended cargo would help push a supposedly dark continent toward a new age. And the next chapter of this story will follow those invisible travelers home. Silk, spices and stories. Medieval trade goes global. The Crusaders returned along roads that were far older than their wars, tracing arteries that had been pulsing quietly through the so-called Dark Ages. In today's compilation, the story now shifts from battlefields and relics to caravans, counting houses and crowded harbors, where the real long-distance flight of ideas and objects took place. Across the Mediterranean, oared galleys and lateen-rigged ships stitched together a world from Alexandria to Barcelona. To the east, overland tracks from the Black Sea and the Caucasus met the vast web often called the Silk Road, a chain of markets and caravanserais rather than one single road, linking Europe to Central Asia, India and China. To the north, a colder network formed as the Hanseatic League bound ports from London and Bruges to Lübeck and Novgorod, its merchants sailing through fog and ice, carrying wax, furs and grain along the grey North and Baltic seas. Through these channels flowed goods that felt almost miraculous to those who first handled them. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon and nutmeg arrived in tiny sacks worth a small fortune, their scents strong enough to cut through the stench of any medieval street. Silk from the distant Chinese courts, fine as spiderweb and shimmering in candlelight, brushed against coarse European wool and set new standards for luxury. Porcelain bowls, hard and resonant as a bell when tapped, challenged local potters' skills. Paper, perfected in the Islamic world and carried westward, gradually replaced costly parchment and opened the door to more affordable records, contracts, and eventually books. Italian city-states, such as Venice and Genoa, stood at crucial junctions of this traffic. Their harbours received cargoes from Muslim, Byzantine, and later Mongol-controlled ports, repackaging Eastern goods for Christian markets farther north. As stated earlier, the label Dark Ages begins to look fragile when confronted with the simple fact that a Venetian ledger might record prices in dinars, ducats, and dirhams on the same page. Needless to say, this commerce demanded new ways of thinking about risk and trust. Merchants formed guilds to defend their interests and standardize weights, measures, and training. Partnerships spread the danger of shipwreck or banditry across several investors, rather than one desperate adventurer. In fairs at Champagne or Bruges, bankers issued bills of exchange, allowing a trader to move credit across borders without hauling chests of coin, an extraordinary innovation that quietly rivaled any knightly feat. For many nobles, this new wealth posed an unsettling challenge. A cloth merchant in Florence or a spice dealer in Lübeck might, by careful calculation and a little luck, outshine an old family in landless cash. Titles still mattered, but money could now move faster than heraldry, and in some cases speak more loudly in city councils. At ground level, the impact seeped into daily existence. New dyes altered the colors of cloaks and veils. Sugar, once an exotic medicine, edged toward the kitchen. Foreign medical texts suggested different treatments for familiar pains. Traveling scholars brought back astronomical tables and philosophical commentaries from the Islamic world, while navigational ideas refined the art of steering by stars and compass. Then, a pattern interrupt. Imagine a quiet English village market at dawn. A few stalls,
rough cloth awnings, the smell of damp earth and bread. Chickens complain in wicker cages. A peddler lays out knives, combs, perhaps a single bright piece of imported cloth that draws every eye. The scene seems utterly local, self-contained, almost motionless in history. Cut sharply to the Venetian waterfront at noon. Bells clang, sailors shout in half a dozen languages, ropes creak and bales thud onto the quay. Spices dust the air, parrots squawk from cages. A clerk, pen tucked behind his ear, shouts figures over the din as he records each crate. The flight had been an eventful one for those cargoes, across deserts, through pirate-haunted straits, past imperial borders and tax collectors. Yet some of this noise will eventually echo in that English village, translated into a brighter dye in a Sunday tunic, a pinch of pepper in a stew, or a fragment of a distant traveller's tale told at the alehouse. Thus, even the most seemingly isolated hamlet stood, invisibly tethered, to Afro-Eurasian networks that spanned thousands of miles. The next part of this history will follow how those growing ties, along with plague, war, and new ideas, began to pull people off the land and into cities, reshaping the very map of medieval life. City air makes you free. The rise of medieval towns. Those invisible threads of trade and rumor soon tightened into something more solid. Stone walls, timber gates, and the dense, humming life of the medieval town. History is often told as a flight from darkness into light, but in today's compilation we explore a more complex ascent, as fields gave way to streets, and a new kind of freedom took root in the shadow of battlements. A typical town in the High Middle Ages announced itself long before its name was known. Approaching along a rutted road, travelers first saw the ring of walls, sometimes patched with older Roman masonry, punctured by stout gates that closed at night. Inside, space was precious. Houses leaned inward over narrow lanes until upper stories nearly touched, turning streets into dim corridors where washing lines, hanging signs, and overhanging roofs formed a low, irregular ceiling. At the center, a market square opened suddenly like a clearing in a forest of wood and stone, dominated by a church tower or town hall that recorded not only the hours, but the ambitions of its citizens. Here, the old logic of the village began to loosen. In parts of Germany, France, and the Low Countries, a terse legal proverb captured the change. Stadtluft macht frei. City air makes free. Under certain town charters, a runaway serf who managed to live within the walls for a year and a day without being reclaimed could claim personal freedom. It was a quiet revolution, written not in manifestos, but in records of residence and court disputes, as lords attempted to retrieve fugitives and councils defended their new taxpayers. Inside those walls, work itself followed a different rhythm. Artisans clustered by trade, a lane of tanners and their stench, a row of smithies with sparks drifting into the dusk, whole quarters where looms thudded behind shuttered windows. Over time, craft guilds emerged to regulate this crowded competition. The guild of bakers might set the weight and price of bread. The blacksmiths could forbid unlicensed rivals from setting up a forge. The weavers inspected cloth for quality before it went to market. Entry into these trades followed a set pattern. A boy, or more rarely, a girl, bound as an apprentice, living in a master's household. Then a journeyman, traveling from town to town, hiring out skills. Finally, a master, admitted to the guild after presenting a masterpiece and proving both competence and resources. This world offered opportunities unknown in the countryside. Cash wages circulated more freely. A clever merchant might, over time, rise from pack peddler to ship owner. Yet the risks were equally pronounced. Crowded houses and open drains turned towns into breeding grounds for disease long before the Black Death. A single kitchen accident,
could become a roaring fire that devoured whole streets. Strangers met at the market, at the alehouse, in the church porch, trading not only goods, but news of distant wars, heresies, and inventions. The flight had been an eventful one, as stated earlier, but here the attempt to escape old hierarchies took on a new, urban intensity. Needless to say, such concentration of wealth and curiosity demanded new forms of learning. As merchants counted profits and city councils drafted charters, another institution began to take shape in cathedral schools and lecture halls. The next chapter in this story follows that institution's rise, the medieval university, where arguments about God, law, and the world would reshape European thought in extraordinary ways. Birth of the university, students, scholars, and street brawls. History is often imagined as a straight road of progress, yet at certain crossroads, entire worlds of thought seem to appear almost overnight. From those cathedral schools and informal lecture halls, a new kind of institution emerged. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and soon after, a constellation of universities that drew ambitious minds from across Europe in a kind of intellectual migration. In today's compilation, this is the moment where learning steps out of the cloister and into the streets. These universities did not begin as grand campuses, but as legal arrangements and fragile agreements. Bologna grew from schools of Roman law, where students from Italy, Spain, and beyond gathered to master legal texts that governed an increasingly complex commercial world. Paris took shape around the Cathedral School of Notre Dame, its theology masters commanding such prestige that kings consulted them. Oxford, in turn, developed as scholars fleeing tensions in Paris attempted a fresh start across the Channel. The flight had been an eventful one in more ways than one. Ideas, methods, and rivalries all crossed the water with them. For the students, the experience could be both exhilarating and miserable. Lectures were delivered in Latin, often at dawn, with a master reading aloud from a treasured book, while rows of young men, some barely out of adolescence, strained to copy every word. Formal disputations turned learning into a kind of verbal tournament, where arguments about grace, free will, or the nature of universals were fired back and forth under strict rules. Between classes, cramped lodgings, poor heating, and erratic food made daily life a test of endurance. Outside the classroom, the reputation of these young scholars was anything but saintly. Many were far from home, answerable mainly to their own university courts, and quick to assert their privileges. Drunken brawls, unpaid tavern bills, and violent clashes with townsfolk became part of the record. The 1355 St. Scholastica Day riots in Oxford, as stated earlier in this series, began with a complaint over bad wine and escalated into a pitched battle that left dozens dead, a grim reminder that the boundary between learning and lawlessness could be dangerously thin. The intellectual program, however, was rigorously structured. Students first faced the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, disciplines that trained them to read, argue, and persuade. Then came the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, a set of studies that framed the measurable world, from the harmony of notes to the movement of the stars. Only after this long apprenticeship could a scholar attempt specialization in law, medicine, or the queen of the sciences, theology. Needless to say, the attempt to master such a curriculum demanded years of disciplined work. Within this framework, extraordinary thinkers tried to reconcile ancient philosophy with Christian doctrine. Thomas Aquinas, teaching in Paris and Italy, worked through the newly translated works of Aristotle with the patience of a careful pilot navigating unfamiliar skies. In massive treatises, he argued that reason and revelation were not enemies, but different flights toward the same truth, a bold claim in an age when heresy trials were very real. Others disagreed,
and the lecture halls rang with disputes over how far human reason could travel without losing faith. It seemed, for a time, that argument itself might reorder the world. Yet even as scholars debated salvation, free will, and the motion of the heavens, another force was silently on the move. In harbours, in flea-ridden cloth, in the holds of trading ships, an invisible enemy prepared an assault that would test Europe's social and intellectual fabric more harshly than any examination. An outbreak that no master of logic could simply argue away. The Black Death arrives. A ship, a rat, a catastrophe. History is often described as a series of sudden storms breaking over an unsuspecting world, and in today's compilation, this particular storm begins with a single, weary ship. In the autumn of 1347, a Genoese vessel limped into a Mediterranean harbour, its flight across the sea less a triumphant voyage and more an attempt at survival. Sailors lay sprawled on the deck, feverish and delirious, their skin blotched, their bodies marked by painful swellings. In the dark of the hold, unseen among the bales of cloth and sacks of grain, fleas carrying Yersinia pestis clung to black rats, ready to disembark. The ship's arrival was not unique. Trade routes had been the arteries of prosperity, connecting ports from the Black Sea to Italy and beyond. Yet this vessel, and others like it, carried an extraordinary passenger that would rewrite the record of the age. As stated earlier, Europe's scholars argued about salvation and the motion of the heavens. But the plague moved according to a different logic, following merchants, pilgrims, and sailors. From Messina and Genoa to Marseille, Pisa, and Venice, it stepped ashore, then travelled inland along river valleys and roads, reaching market towns and quiet villages with terrifying speed. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to capture what they were seeing. They wrote of sudden fevers and headaches, of swellings in the groin, armpits, and neck that grew to the size of eggs or apples, of skin that darkened at the extremities until fingers and toes seemed almost black. The flight had been an eventful one for the disease itself. In some places it appeared in bubonic form. In others it seemed to leap from person to person through the air, striking down entire households within days. Physicians in long robes and beaked masks attempted remedies based on humours, astrology, and prayer, but the death rate mocked every learned attempt at cure. In town after town, the story repeated itself. Bells tolled without pause until there were not enough living hands to pull the ropes. Graveyards filled, then overflowed, and pits were dug in haste beyond the walls. Bodies laid in layers, dust to dust without ceremony. Entire villages were left deserted, doors swinging open, fields untended, livestock wandering through abandoned streets. Needless to say, later generations would struggle to comprehend the scale. In only a few years, perhaps a third, perhaps even half of Europe's population vanished from the record of the living. Yet even amid this devastation, history did not simply end. It was forced onto a new course. With so many dead, labor grew scarce. Wages in some regions rose, and surviving peasants could bargain in ways their parents had scarcely imagined. Monasteries lost scribes, parishes lost priests, and faith itself was shaken as prayers seemed to go unanswered. In today's compilation, we explore how this catastrophe did more than kill. It cracked open old hierarchies. The question that follows is inescapable. Once the plague had passed, what kind of world did the survivors attempt to rebuild, and how far could they reshape the medieval order they had inherited? After the plague, wages, revolts, and new chances. Power in medieval Europe had long rested on the quiet assumption that most people were replaceable. Fields, rents, and dues would always have hands to work them. After the Black Death, that assumption broke. Across England, France, the German lands, and beyond, entire villages lay half empty. Harvests rotted for lack of labour,
And suddenly, the humblest ploughman found that his absence could be felt as sharply as that of a knight. In today's compilation, we explore how this invisible shift in bargaining power began to remake daily life. Fewer workers meant competition for their labor. In towns, surviving artisans and apprentices could demand higher wages, shorter terms, or better food and lodging. In the countryside, peasants pressed for reduced rents, commuted forced labor into money payments, or simply walked away to a lord offering better conditions. For the first time in generations, some families could attempt a modest social ascent rather than merely endure. Needless to say, this new freedom did not please those who had grown accustomed to obedience. Lords wrote bitter letters complaining that servants refused to work for the old rates, that harvests were delayed unless extra pennies were offered, that young men treated their masters with what was called insolence. The response was not negotiation, but law. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and ordered labourers to accept work at those rates on pain of fines, imprisonment, or branding. Here the pattern interrupt appears most starkly. A chronicler might record a nobleman lamenting that a common reaper dared to ask for double pay, calling it an affront to the order of the world. Yet somewhere in a smoky cottage, that same reaper sat over a rough table, quietly calculating. Fields lay idle, towns needed hands, distant manors sent word that they would pay more. For the first time, he could imagine his children eating regularly, perhaps even holding a strip of land in their own right. The lord saw insolence, the peasant saw an opening. Coercive laws did not prevent deeper transformations. As stated earlier, many holdings had lost entire tenant families. Some peasants stepped into the gaps, taking over abandoned plots and piecing together larger farms. Others negotiated outright freedom from old services in exchange for reliable money rents. At the same time, great landlords consolidated scattered, vacant holdings into compact estates, turning arable into pasture and hiring wage labor instead of relying on serfs. The manorial system, that intricate web of customary dues and obligations, began to crack in places. Resistance did not remain quiet. By 1381 in England, grievances over repeated poll taxes, the enforcement of labor laws, and the corruption of local officials erupted into open revolt. The English Rising saw peasants, artisans, and even minor clerks march on London, burn records, and demand an end to serfdom and oppressive taxation. The flight had been an eventful one, so to speak. For a brief moment, the social order itself seemed in play. Though the rebellion was crushed, its memory lingered, a warning that those once deemed voiceless could act in concert. From these tensions emerged a Europe in which mobility, wage labor, and negotiated contracts played a growing role, setting the stage for further upheavals in belief, power, and culture that followed. Faith shaken, flagellants, scapegoats, and quiet doubts. History is often imagined as a grand cathedral of belief, its pillars solid and unshakable, yet moments of catastrophe reveal the cracks running through the stone. In today's compilation, this becomes painfully clear as plague and war test not only bodies and economies, as stated earlier, but the very faith that had ordered medieval life. In the mid-14th century, as the Black Death swept across Europe, many saw not a disease but a sentence. Processions threaded through towns and villages. Long lines of flagellants, barefoot and chanting, marched in slow, rhythmic flight through muddy streets. They stripped to the waist and whipped their own backs until the skin split and blood ran, believing that such public penance might appease divine wrath. Bells tolled, hymns rose, and behind them followed crowds, heading on mass pilgrimages to renowned shrines, from Compostela in the far west to local relics of saints thought to have once healed fevers or survived earlier plagues. Needless to say, terror also demanded a culprit. In an extraordinary and tragic distortion of Christian teaching, minorities became convenient targets. Jewish communities, already confined by law and custom, were accused of poisoning wells and conspiring to destroy Christendom. In cities along the Rhine, from Strasbourg to Cologne, records tell of massacres in which entire neighborhoods were burned or driven into the river. Elsewhere, councils issued decrees expelling Jews outright, erasing centuries of local presence in a single violent attempt to restore a sense of control. The institutional church itself did not emerge unscathed. Many parish priests, monks and nuns stayed in infected towns, tending the dying, administering last rites in houses where the air seemed to vibrate with coughing and prayer. Monastic chronicles quietly note whole communities reduced by half in a single season. Yet other clergy fled to safer country estates or fortified houses, abandoning flocks whose burials multiplied in the churchyards. Such contrasting behavior, recorded in wills and complaints, damaged moral authority in some regions and planted a lingering suspicion. If shepherds ran at the first sign of wolves, what did that say about the flock's place in the world? Beneath the public drama of flagellants and persecutions, quieter shifts took shape. Ordinary believers began asking, sometimes only in whispers, why a just God allowed children and faithful priests to die while notorious sinners survived. Lay religious movements, emphasizing personal prayer, reading where books could be obtained, and a more direct relationship with the divine, slowly gathered strength. The flight had been an eventful one for medieval Christianity, a long, turbulent attempt to navigate between inherited certainties and raw experience. From these doubts and experiments in devotion, new voices would soon emerge, prepared not merely to question indulgences or local abuses, but to challenge the very structure of the medieval church itself. And their next attempts would leave a record that could no longer be contained within monastery walls. Heretics and reformers. Cracks in the medieval church. Those voices did not remain whispers for long. In today's compilation, the story now widens to those who stepped out of line entirely. Men and women whose attempts at spiritual reform would test the limits of medieval tolerance and expose deep fractures in the church that claimed to bind Christendom into a single, unbroken body. We begin by delving into the Waldensians, followers of a wealthy merchant from Lyon named Peter Waldo, who in the late 12th century gave away his fortune and set out to preach a life of radical simplicity. Inspired by the Gospels, they emphasized apostolic poverty, traveling in pairs, reciting scripture, and attempting a kind of spiritual solo flight outside established clerical channels. Their insistence on preaching without episcopal permission and their early interest in translating scripture into the vernacular turned what might have been a local curiosity into an international problem. As stated earlier, the medieval church was not merely a religious institution. It was a pillar of social order. To church authorities, unauthorized preachers who challenged wealth and hierarchy looked less like harmless idealists and more like pilots trying to rewrite the flight manual mid-air. Councils met, decrees were drafted, and inquisitors were dispatched to test doctrine, record testimonies, and, where necessary, extinguish dangerous ideas. The flight had been an eventful one for the Waldensians. Condemned as heretics, driven into the Alpine valleys, they survived in scattered communities, a living reminder that dissent could not be entirely erased. In England, another current of protest emerged in the late 14th century around the teachings of John Wycliffe. His followers, later called Lollards, attacked clerical luxury, questioned transubstantiation, and promoted English translations of the Bible so that ordinary believers could hear scripture in their own tongue. To sympathetic artisans and minor gentry, this promised an extraordinary new access to sacred truth. To bishops and princes, it threatened a breakdown of obedience. Royal commissions, heresy trials, and public burnings followed, a grim attempt to set a record that doctrinal unity would be defended with fire if necessary. The stakes became even higher in Bohemia. There, the preacher Jan Hus drew on Wycliffe's writings and local grievances to condemn simony, indulgent sales, and moral corruption among the clergy. His sermons at Bethlehem Chapel in Prague attracted crowds, turning a local reform attempt into a national cause. Summoned to the Council of Constance under a promise of safe conduct, Hus expected debate. Instead, he faced imprisonment, condemnation, and execution by burning in 1415. Needless to say, his death did not end the controversy. It ignited the Hussite Wars, a series of fierce conflicts in which Czech armies, using innovative tactics and wagon forts, defied crusading forces and forced concessions from both emperor and pope. Yet even within orthodoxy, the desire for a more immediate encounter with the divine reshaped religious life. Mystics, such as Meister Eckhart or Catherine of Siena, spoke of an inner union with God that could bypass elaborate institutional mediation. Lay confraternities organized processions, charity, and shared devotions, offering ordinary townspeople a structured but more personal piety, half inside and half outside traditional parish control. In these movements, the late medieval world experimented with new spiritual routes, some officially approved, others merely tolerated. All the while, behind sermons, trials, and visions, another drama unfolded. As church and reformers wrestled over souls, princes and kingdoms were locked in their own long campaigns, where banners, taxes, and fortresses mattered more than theology. The next story turns to that slower, grinding conflict, one that would redraw borders, drain treasuries, and leave a record of devastation across the map of Western Europe. The 100 Years' War, a century of crowns and mud power, in this era did not only rest on pulpits and parchment, it also rode on horseback, cloaked in heraldry, convinced that crowns could be measured in acres and blood. In today's compilation, the next long, grinding story is the 100 Years' War, a conflict that was less a single unbroken struggle than a series of campaigns, truces, and uneasy pauses, stretching from 1337 to 1453. It began with a tangle of family trees. When the French Capetian line failed in the early 14th century, the English King Edward III, grandson of a French monarch through his mother, claimed that this lineage entitled him to the throne of France. French nobles disagreed, preferring a cousin from the male line, Philip VI. What followed was not an immediate, constant clash, but intermittent warfare, bursts of sieges and pitched battles, followed by years of negotiation, plague, or exhaustion, as both kingdoms attempted to balance internal revolts, empty treasuries, and the slow bureaucratic attempt to record every tax and feudal obligation. On the battlefield, the war tore away some of the older myths of knighthood. At Crécy in 1346, English forces, many of them archers, faced a larger French army in a confrontation that would echo through military history. The English longbowmen, trained to send arrows in a deadly flight at astonishing speed, cut down advancing cavalry. Mud, churned by hooves and rain, dragged at the armor of men who had once seemed invincible. The pattern repeated at Poitiers, and again, decades later, at Agincourt in 1415, where narrow ground, sodden fields, and disciplined volleys turned French charges into chaotic, suffocating heaps of metal and flesh. Yet the romance often painted over this period bears little resemblance to the lived experience. Imagine a grand 19th century canvas, banners streaming, armor gleaming, commanders posed with the poise of an aviator before a record-breaking attempt. Now, strip away the varnish.
The reality was rain-soaked gambesons, dysentery in the ditches, horses screaming, and terrified camp followers trying to salvage food and children from burning villages. That pattern interrupt between art and mud is essential. Without it, the story becomes propaganda rather than history. For civilians, the war meant devastation that arrived in waves. Armies marched through the countryside, seizing grain, torching barns, and leaving fields unplanted. Mercenary bands, suddenly unemployed during truces, roamed as free companies, turning military skill into organized robbery. Heavy taxation funded each new campaign. Special levies on wool in England, aids and tails in France, all carefully noted but bitterly resented. Villages rebuilt, only to see the front line shift again, bringing another round of requisitions and ruin. Over time, this prolonged ordeal helped forge distinct senses of English and French identity. Rulers sponsored chronicles and sermons that framed victories as proof of divine favor and defeats as tests of national resolve. Language policies elevated French in royal administration, while English, long overshadowed by Norman French, gained prestige through law and literature. Shared memories of Crécy or the fall of Orléans became points of pride or trauma, turning dynastic quarrels into stories of entire peoples under threat. As stated earlier, such conflicts did not unfold in isolation. They intersected with plague, rebellion, and the slow emergence of new technologies, each campaign another thread in a wider European tapestry. The flight had been an eventful one for both kingdoms, but the landing would be rough. Exhausted finances, scarred landscapes, and monarchies forced to rethink how power should be organized. The next chapter turns from open battlefields to the quieter revolutions in trade, cities, and daily labor that began reshaping this war-torn world from within. Joan of Arc, visions, armor, and the fire. History is often described as a battlefield of dates and dynasties, yet sometimes a single, improbable life cuts through the smoke more sharply than any army. As stated earlier, exhausted kingdoms were learning to fight with contracts and taxes as much as with swords. Into that weary world stepped a teenage peasant who spoke of saints, banners, and fire. In today's compilation, we explore the story of Joan of Arc, born around 1412 in the small village of Domremy, on the fractured frontier between English and French claims. She could not read, owned no book, and had no prospect beyond tending fields and animals. Yet she began to report that heavenly voices spoke to her. St. Michael, St. Catherine, St. Margaret. They urged her to support the French Dauphin, Charles, and to drive the English from the kingdom. In an age when visions were both feared and revered, such a claim was extraordinary rather than absurd. Convincing anyone to listen was another matter. Joan's first attempts to reach noble patrons met with laughter and dismissal. Still she persisted, crossing war-torn territory to the fortress town of Vaucouleurs, insisting that God had given her a mission. Eventually, a local commander agreed to send her to Charles's court, an attempt that resembled a desperate last throw rather than a serious strategy. The journey itself was dangerous. Bandits, enemy scouts, and the sheer suspicion that a peasant girl traveling in men's company might attract. Yet she arrived at Chinon, where the Dauphin, testing her, hid among his courtiers, only for Joan to walk directly to him. Skepticism did not end there. Charles ordered theologians and clerics to interrogate her for weeks at Poitiers. They examined her doctrine, demanded details of her visions, and even subjected her to a physical inspection to confirm her virginity, believing that chastity might be a sign of divine favor. Only after this intricate inquest did they permit her to don armor, carry a banner, and accompany the army as a kind of spiritual pilot, rather than a conventional commander. The flight had been an eventful one for France. At Orléans in 1429,
Her presence coincided with a dramatic lifting of the English siege. Contemporary records disagree on her exact tactical role, but all agree that soldiers followed her white banner into assaults they had previously feared to attempt. Morale soared. Within months, she stood beside Charles at Reims as he was crowned king, transforming a shaky claimant into a monarch stamped in many minds with heaven's approval. Her enemies adapted more quickly than her allies. Captured outside Compiègne by Burgundian forces allied to the English, Joan was sold and delivered to Rouen for trial. There, English-backed clerics charged her with heresy, false visions, and, crucially, cross-dressing, her insistence on wearing male armor and clothing. The questions were relentless, probing her visions, her obedience to the church, even her grammar. Some judges may have felt genuine religious anxiety. Others clearly saw a chance to discredit Charles's coronation by destroying its most visible saint. In 1431, after a coerced abjuration and a disputed relapse, she was condemned and burned in the marketplace, only 19 years old. Witnesses later recalled the smoke, the cries, and the moment someone held up a charred heart that the flames had failed to consume. Needless to say, her death did not end the war, but it fixed her as a symbol. Faith and defiance wrapped in steel and ash. It can seem that Joan's pyre marked the last flare of a world in which saints stepped into battles and visions directed kings. Yet even as the fire died down in Rouen, guns were thundering louder on European fields, printers were preparing to shatter the monopoly on written words, and new navigators were plotting a very different kind of flight across the world. The next chapter turns to those emerging tools and ideas, and to the quiet revolution they would unleash on this so-called Age of Darkness. Gothic cathedrals, stone, light, and the engineering of faith guns, printers, navigators, all signs of a changing age. Yet, in the heart of medieval cities, another kind of revolution had already taken flight, not in the sky, but in stone and light. To step through the doors of a Gothic cathedral was to cross an invisible border, leaving the cramped, muddy streets for a world that seemed to belong to another planet. Inside, space itself appeared to stretch. Columns rose like stone forests, branching into ribbed vaults that disappeared into shadow, so high that the human voice dissolved before reaching the ceiling. Sunlight, filtered through stained glass, broke into reds, blues, and golds that flooded the nave, painting the floor and faces with moving color. Incense hung in the air, candles flickered. For a medieval pilgrim, this was not simply a building, it was a controlled vision of heaven on earth. Such height and openness did not appear by accident. Earlier Romanesque churches, heavy with round arches and thick walls, had already tested the limits of masonry. Gothic architects, in today's compilation of medieval achievements, pushed further. The pointed arch distributed weight more efficiently, allowing vaults to soar. Ribbed vaults acted as a skeletal framework, guiding the load to slender columns. Outside, flying buttresses reached out from the walls like stone arms, catching the thrust of the roof and carrying it down to the ground. The result was a structural paradox. Taller buildings with thinner walls, and therefore more room for glass. Enormous windows could now be cut into what had once been solid stone. The flight of engineering imagination met the radiance of colored glass, and cathedrals became instruments for orchestrating light itself. In terms of architectural history, this was as radical as any later iron bridge or skyscraper. Behind that elegance lay a very human story. A cathedral was not the work of a single architect genius, but of generations. Masons who laid the first foundation stones died long before the spire was finished. Their grandchildren might carve the final tracery, Carpenters raised forests of scaffolding. Glassmakers experimented with minerals to achieve deeper blues and rubies that seemed to burn even on cloudy days. Local farmers hauled stone in slow processions. Merchants and princes competed to fund chapels and altars that would record their names in eternity. The building itself functioned as a teaching machine in a world where most people could not read. Portals bristled with sculptures of saints, sinners, and grotesques acting out biblical dramas. Tympanums showed the Last Judgment in terrifying detail. Inside, stained glass windows unfolded the story of creation, the lives of prophets, and the parables of Christ, panel by panel. Even the floor plan, often in the shape of a cross, carried theological meaning, turning every procession into a silent reenactment of sacred history. Needless to say, such cathedrals dominated the medieval skyline, their spires serving as both landmarks and sermons in stone. Yet, as stated earlier, another quieter architecture was emerging, not of arches and buttresses, but of margins and movable type. While cathedrals reached for heaven in stone and glass, a different project in ink and paper was preparing to carry ideas far beyond any nave toward a world where the next great attempt at preserving and spreading knowledge would no longer depend on a pulpit at all. Before the printing press, books as treasures. Ideas had their own kind of flight long before engines and wings, but in the medieval world, that journey was painfully slow. Knowledge did not roar across continents. It crept, parchment by parchment, through candlelit rooms where a single mistake could ruin months of work. To understand the impact of printing, the story must return to the manuscript itself as an extraordinary object. Parchment began as animal skin, soaked, scraped, stretched on frames until it yielded smooth, pale sheets. Scribes then ruled faint lines across it, an invisible runway for their text. Each word was copied by hand from an older volume, letter shapes rehearsed so often that the script became a kind of disciplined choreography. In some monasteries, a large Bible might represent the labor of several years, an attempt that consumed entire herds and the eyesight of more than one exhausted copyist. Illuminators followed, turning margins into miniature worlds. Gold leaf was pressed onto glue, catching the light as though the page itself were lit from within. Saints, monsters, curling vines, and heraldic beasts crowded the borders, not merely decoration, but a visual commentary on the sacred or scholarly record unfolding in the center. Finally, binders stitched gatherings of pages, clamped them between wooden boards, and covered them in leather, sometimes with metal bosses or jewels. The result was less a book in the modern sense than a portable shrine. Needless to say, such shrines were rare. As stated earlier, monasteries and cathedral schools served as the main archives of written memory, and their libraries might hold only a few dozen or a few hundred volumes. Shelves were sparse, and the most precious works were literally chained to lecterns, heavy iron links ensuring that the book stayed where it belonged. Access was restricted to clergy, scholars, and a thin layer of wealthy lay patrons who could afford to commission their own manuscripts. For the average villager whose world extended only a few miles from home, a glimpse of a chained Bible could be a once-in-a-lifetime encounter. In this environment, the spread of ideas moved at a walking pace. A new theological treatise in Paris might take decades to appear in Prague or York, dependent on whether anyone considered it worth copying, whether a patron would fund the attempt, whether a traveling scholar carried a version across the mountains. Intellectual revolutions did not erupt overnight. They seeped through Europe in slow, uneven currents. Yet even in this age of parchment, experiments were underway. Paper, long used in China and carried through the Islamic world, entered European workshops, cheaper and easier to produce than animal skin. Artisans in the German lands and the Low Countries began carving entire pages of text and image into wooden blocks, inking them, and pressing them onto paper in a kind of primitive printing. Block books of saints' lives or simple devotional images appeared, but each block still had to be carved anew. Altering a single word meant remaking an entire page. In today's compilation, this is the moment where the pattern suddenly shifts. Into a world of chained volumes and laborious copying, into workshops smelling of ink, metal, and damp paper, stepped a goldsmith from Mainz, an unlikely pilot of a different sort of flight, whose quiet experiments with movable metal type would soon attempt something no manuscript culture could match. What happened when his press finally began to run would not only shatter the old bottlenecks, it would force Europe to confront a terrifying question. What if words could travel faster than those who sought to control them? Gutenberg's revolution. When words learned to multiply, history is often imagined as a slow river, yet sometimes a single invention turns that river into white water. In today's compilation, this moment arrives in a dim workshop in Mainz, where a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg coaxed words into learning how to multiply. Gutenberg had no royal title, no university chair, only a restless mind and practical skills. Drawing on metalworking techniques, he began to cast individual letters, movable metal type, that could be arranged, inked, pressed onto paper, then broken apart and used again. Around this simple but extraordinary idea, he built a system. A sticky, oil-based ink that clung to metal instead of soaking into parchment, and a modified wine press whose screw mechanism could drive type and paper together with even pressure. The result was not a single clever gadget, but a coordinated machine for repetition. As stated earlier, manuscript culture in the medieval world depended on human endurance. In a cold scriptorium, a monk bent over a single page, tracing each letter by hand, perhaps completing only a few pages in a long day. Now cut sharply to another scene, the same text, the same Latin words, but set in neat lines of metal type. A printer pulls a heavy lever, the press descends. A sheet is lifted away, then another, a mechanical rhythm replacing the slow devotional flight of the quill. 1 page an hour becomes hundreds of impressions in the same span of time. Gutenberg's great demonstration piece was the Bible. Around the mid-1450s, his workshop produced what later generations would call the Gutenberg Bible, a monumental 2-volume work in Latin. Its black-letter type imitated the elegant script of high-quality manuscripts, but its pages were startlingly uniform, the text clear and regular, in a way even the best scribes struggled to match. Though still expensive, a printed Bible cost far less than one copied entirely by hand, where parchment, labor, and the risk of error all drove the price toward that of a small house. The implications spread quickly. Printing slashed the cost of reproduction and shattered the old record for speed. Religious texts could be produced in runs of hundreds. Legal codes, once guarded in a few central archives, could be printed for regional courts. University lecture notes and classical authors circulated with a breadth previously unthinkable. In time, printers extended their attempts beyond Latin into vernacular tongues, giving merchants, artisans, and minor officials access to texts that had once belonged almost exclusively to clergy and scholars. Needless to say, this new power over words inspired both hope and anxiety. Church and princely authorities saw an instrument for standardizing doctrine and law, for fixing the correct creed, the authorized calendar, the official interpretation of events. At the same time, there was a growing fear. What if presses fell into the hands of those who challenged that authority, spreading unregulated sermons, biting satires, or radical pamphlets faster than censors could react? In the decades that followed, presses multiplied across the German lands, into Italy, France, England, and beyond, each new workshop a potential engine of order or dissent. The medieval world, in attempting to preserve its teachings more efficiently,
had accidentally laid a runway for the Renaissance and the Reformation. The flight had been an eventful one already, but the next chapters in this story would show just how turbulent the air could become once printed words began to cross borders that armies alone had never breached. Medicine, magic, and misunderstanding. How medieval people healed. If printed words were the new engines of change, then illness remained the old familiar turbulence that no town or monastery could escape. In today's compilation, the story of the so-called Dark Ages turns inward into the human body, where pain, prayer, and experiment met in uneasy alliance. Medieval medicine, at least among the educated, was anchored in a theory far older than any cathedral. Scholars trained in Latin read Galen and Hippocrates, inheriting the classical idea that the body was governed by four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health meant balance. Disease meant a humour in excess or deficiency. Treatment became a kind of careful flight through the elements, adjusting diet, sleep, baths, and purges to restore equilibrium. A fever might be blamed on too much hot, moist blood. The remedy could involve cooling foods, rest in a shaded room, and, very often, the scarlet line of a lancet. As stated earlier, with education and power, hierarchy shaped access. At the top stood university-trained physicians who quoted authorities, drew up elaborate case histories, and might even consult astrological charts before prescribing a course of action. Below them operated barber surgeons, more artisans than scholars, who pulled teeth, set broken bones, lanced abscesses, and performed amputations with grim efficiency. Their red and white poles recalled both blood and bandages, an everyday record of work that was at once practical and perilous. Outside the lecture halls, other healers worked in quieter spaces. Midwives guided births, relying on long experience, herbal infusions, and whispered prayers to the Virgin. Local herbalists collected plants from hedgerow and forest, drying them in cottage rafters, preparing ointments of comfrey for broken bones, willow bark for pain, or garlic and onion poultices for infected wounds. Folk practitioners blended empirical observation with charms, spoken in the vernacular rather than Latin, tracing the sign of the cross over a swollen joint while applying a paste whose ingredients had been tested over generations. Needless to say, not every remedy was benign. Bloodletting, sanctioned by humoral theory, could be ordered again and again until a weakened patient slipped beyond recovery. Purges and emetics might dehydrate the already frail. Yet mixed among these hazardous attempts were measures that modern science would recognize. Quarantines during plague outbreaks, simple rules about separating clean water from waste, and the insistence that certain wounds be washed, not merely bound, before closing. The boundary between medicine and magic rarely formed a straight line. A physician might time a treatment according to the position of Mars, then carefully observe whether the pulse strengthened. A mother might hang an amulet containing a saint's relic over a child's bed, while also cooling a fevered forehead with vinegar and water. In this world, saints, stars, and surgery coexisted, each another potential pilot in the desperate effort to steer a body back from disaster. In such a town, the course of an illness depended less on abstract science than on status, gender, and luck. An aristocrat might summon a learned physician. A peasant might rely on a neighbor's herbs and a shrine's protection. The next question in this story is simple yet profound. What did ordinary men and women actually believe was happening inside their bodies and souls when sickness struck? And how did that belief shape the world that followed? Crime and punishment. Was the Middle Ages more violent? If the body was a battleground of unseen forces, then the village itself was another arena,
where order and chaos struggled for control. In today's compilation, the story now shifts from sickness and souls to something more concrete. What happened when neighbors quarreled, when tempers broke, and when blood was actually shed. Medieval crime, in the ordinary sense, was rarely the grand treason and heresy that dominate later chronicles. Most cases in the manorial rolls concern thefts of grain or tools, arguments over hedges and streams, insults shouted across a muddy lane, and the occasional punch, broken bone, or dead pig. Local courts, presided over by lords or their stewards, handled these disputes with an almost bureaucratic regularity, handing down fines, orders to pay compensation, and sworn promises to keep the peace. The flight of daily life, in legal terms, was dominated less by gallows than by accounting. Yet the image that has survived in popular history is one of whips, racks, and roaring crowds. Public executions, deliberate mutilations, and the humiliating confinement of the stocks or pillory were certainly real, and they were meant to be seen. A hanging in a market square or a hand struck off for theft functioned as theatre, a grim performance in which the ruler appeared as both avenger and guardian. The condemned body became a kind of living record, a warning that authority could reach into flesh and bone. Here a pattern interrupt suggests itself. Picture a beheading in a crowded town square, the block glistening with old stains, the executioner's axe raised, the murmur of hundreds of voices rising to a sharp intake of breath as the blade falls. Now set beside it, a modern drone strike, a distant explosion observed on a grainy screen by a pilot who sits thousands of miles away, guiding the attack almost as a detached aviator of a video game world. Which scene feels more civilized and why? As stated earlier, violence in the Middle Ages was intimate and visible. Homicide rates in some regions, where records survive, appear far higher than those in most modern European states, and warfare meant fields strewn with bodies seen at arm's length. Yet the same centuries never witnessed the industrial killing of the 20th century, the mechanized flight of bombs, or the annihilation of cities in minutes. The comparison complicates any simple verdict on which age was more brutal. Alongside the spectacle of punishment, there were also mechanisms of peace. Lords and bishops brokered truces between warring nobles. The so-called Truce of God sought to limit fighting on holy days and during certain seasons. Churches offered sanctuary, allowing fugitives a brief, sacred reprieve, while elaborate systems of oaths and sureties bound neighbors to guarantee one another's behavior, absorbing feuds before they spiraled. Needless to say, these attempts did not always succeed, but they reveal a continuous, conscious attempt to domesticate violence. In the next stage of this story, attention turns from the courtroom and scaffold to the wider landscape of power. Castles, knights, and the real experience of medieval warfare beyond the polished myths. Jews, Muslims, and outsiders, tolerance and persecution. If the courtroom tried to tame violence, the streets and alleys of medieval towns revealed another frontier of control, the uneasy management of those who did not fit the dominant faith. History in this period was not only a record of kings and knights, but of neighbors watching one another across invisible lines of belief. In today's compilation, attention shifts to Jewish communities scattered through the market centers of Christian Europe. From London to Cologne, from Prague to small Rhineland towns, Jewish families became essential to urban life. Barred in many places from owning land or joining craft guilds, they were steered into roles that Christian doctrine treated with suspicion, yet desperately needed. Long-distance trade, money lending, and tax farming. Princes granted charters promising protection, fixed interest rates, and the right to maintain synagogues and schools. The same documents reminded them that their lives and property ultimately belonged to the ruler. It was a legal flight between safety and vulnerability, written in careful Latin clauses. Scholarship flourished in these enclaves. Rabbis debated law in commentaries that still survive, while physicians trained in Arabic and Hebrew texts treated Christian elites whose priests distrusted pagan learning. As stated earlier, monasteries preserved fragments of Greek and Roman thought. Jewish and Muslim scholars often preserved the rest, transmitting Aristotle, Galen, and mathematical works that would later help fuel the Renaissance. Nowhere did this cultural exchange appear more clearly than in medieval Spain. Under Muslim rule in Al-Andalus, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian intellectuals shared cities, translated one another's books, and argued over philosophy in courts where Arabic was the language of power. Later, when Christian kingdoms advanced south, some of that coexistence continued in altered form. Jewish financiers helped new rulers stabilize their conquests. Mozarabic and Morisco communities negotiated life under changing masters. The flight had been an eventful one, and its turbulence would grow. For alongside periods of relative tolerance came eruptions of terror. Preachers on crusade branded Jews as enemies within. Massacres followed in the Rhineland as armed bands attacked communities that had never seen Jerusalem. Blood libels accused Jews of murdering Christian children in secret rituals. During the Black Death, panicked crowds blamed poisoned wells and drove entire settlements to suicide or slaughter. Kings who had once valued Jewish credit expelled them from England in 1290, from much of France in waves, and in 1492 from Spain itself, as Ferdinand and Isabella demanded conversion or exile in the same year. Their ships crossed the Atlantic in a world-changing attempt at empire. Other outsiders carried their own burdens. Lepers were penned into colonies by laws that treated disease as moral contagion. Heretics from Cathars to Lollards faced crusades, inquisitions, and the fire. Romani groups arriving in late medieval Europe were branded as ruthless and dangerous, subjected to special taxes, travel bans, and legends that clung for centuries. Needless to say, these patterns of guarded inclusion and sudden exclusion did not end with the Middle Ages. As the medieval world edged toward the Renaissance and new oceans opened, the habits learned in cramped ghettos, segregated leper houses, and suspicious border posts would board the ships too, shaping first encounters with unfamiliar peoples far beyond Europe's shores. And the next stage of this story asks what happened when those worlds finally met. Art, music, and storytelling. The colorful medieval imagination. Those ships did not only carry merchants and missionaries, they carried imaginations trained in a particular palette of fear and wonder. Yet inside the very monasteries and market towns that feared outsiders, interiors blazed with color in a way that would surprise many modern visitors. Bare stone walls, so familiar from ruined castles and echoing churches, were once smothered in reds, blues, and golds. Statues of saints were painted with lifelike skin, bright garments, and even gilded halos, while nobles stepped through those spaces in embroidered tunics, fur-trimmed cloaks, and patterned hose rather than anonymous brown cloth. In today's compilation, we explore how this visual world functioned as both decoration and instruction. Illuminated manuscripts turned the written word into a theater of pigment and precious metal. A single initial letter might explode into vines, beasts, and angels, the page shimmering under candlelight. Owning such a book, which could cost more than a house, was a public record of status and piety. On colder stone, vast wall paintings retold biblical stories for those who could not read, while in great halls, tapestries showed hunting scenes, sieges, or legendary battles, muffling drafts and announcing lineage in one woven attempt at self-advertisement. Sound matched sight. In monasteries, the day unfolded to chant, the measured rise and fall of voices turning psalms into a kind of slow, collective flight toward the divine. Outside cloister walls, minstrels and troubadours carried secular songs from castle to town,
celebrating courtly love, mocking hypocrisy, or praising local patrons. Feasts and fairs echoed with lutes, harps, and the piercing cry of shawms. Drums and bells cut through the air as dancers spun on beaten earth floors, and even simple work songs helped anchor the rhythm of labor to the turning of the seasons. Alongside this music ran a powerful oral tradition. As stated earlier, written chronicles preserved one version of events, but around hearths and in taverns another record took shape. Epic tales such as the Song of Roland turned battlefield disaster into heroic sacrifice, while Arthurian legends blended Celtic myth, Christian symbolism, and political wishful thinking into a world of round tables and enchanted forests. Local storytellers folded in their own saints, devils, and haunted crossroads, crafting narratives that warned against treachery, praised loyalty, and explained why a ruined tower or a lonely hill mattered in that community's history. Step through the door of a busy tavern at night, and the scene would be anything but dark. Smoke curling in lamplight, dice clattering, a rough chorus following a half-remembered refrain, a pilot of tales testing a new story on a restless crowd. Needless to say, this was not a world of silence and gloom. The flight had been an eventful one from Rome to the Renaissance in more ways than one. So, how did later centuries manage to repaint this noisy, colourful age in shades of grey? And what did they gain by calling it dark? From ploughs to clocks, everyday medieval innovations. History is often imagined as moving in great leaps, but in the medieval world it advanced in inches, turned furrows, tightened straps, and slowly ticking gears. In today's compilation, the so-called Dark Ages begin to look far less static once the focus shifts from thrones and cathedrals to fields, workshops, and village streets. The transformation began in the soil. Across northern Europe, heavy, wet ground once defeated the light scratch ploughs inherited from Rome. Then the heavy plough appeared, an iron-tipped, wheeled contraption with a mould board that cut, lifted, and turned the earth. Pulled not by weary oxen alone, but increasingly by horses fitted with a new padded horse collar, it allowed deeper cultivation and faster work. The old throat-choking yokes that had strangled a horse's breath were pushed aside. The new collar shifted the strain to chest and shoulders, turning the animal into a true agricultural engine. Around this, a different rhythm of the year emerged. The three-field system divided land into autumn grain, spring crops, and fallow, rotating each year. More acres under seed meant more bread, more fodder, and crucially, more surviving children. As stated earlier, population growth before the Black Death did not appear out of nowhere. It rested on such incremental advances, repeated farm by farm, village by village. Water, too, was harnessed with fresh determination. Watermills, once rare curiosities, multiplied along streams and rivers, grinding grain, fulling cloth, even powering simple hammers. Where wind was stronger than running water, tall wooden windmills rose over flat landscapes, their turning sails announcing both technological ambition and local pride. These were not the inventions of solitary geniuses, but of millwrights, carpenters, and metalworkers who experimented, repaired, and improved in quiet anonymity. Then comes the pattern interrupt. Imagine the stereotypical, timeless, medieval village, ruled only by sunrise, the church bell at noon, and dusk. Into this world steps a new presence on the market square. A mechanical clock, its gears and weights painstakingly assembled by urban craftsmen. Suddenly the day is no longer an undivided stretch of labor. It is sliced into measurable hours. Monasteries refine their prayer schedules. Town councils hold meetings by the clock, and merchants time a journey or a business attempt with new precision. Time itself becomes a kind of stern aviator, piloting the community through the day. Along coasts and rivers, other machines took to water. Stronger ship hulls, improved rudders, and better sails allowed longer voyages, while magnetic compasses and portolan charts edged navigation away from pure guesswork toward recorded experience. The flight had been an eventful one, from fragile coastal craft to broad-beamed cogs and caravels that would eventually circle the world. On land, armor and weapons evolved in parallel. Chain mail gave way, slowly, to plates of steel that turned a mounted knight into a moving fortress. Needless to say, such changes altered not only the battlefield, but also the balance between lords, mercenaries, and common soldiers. In the end, these were modest shifts when viewed alone, but together they rewired daily existence. From ploughs to clocks, mills to ships, the Middle Ages were not a pause in history, but a workshop. The next question is how this busy, inventive world coped when catastrophe, plague, war, and religious conflict swept across its fragile systems and tested every quiet innovation it had built. East of Eden, Byzantium, and the Islamic Golden Age. Catastrophe did not fall on a silent continent. While plague and war tore at Western Europe's fragile systems, other regions were staging their own flights of innovation and power, casting a very different light across the medieval world. In today's compilation, the story widens beyond muddy fields and stone keeps to a glittering arc that ran from Constantinople to Baghdad, from Cairo to Cordoba. The Byzantine Empire stood first in this expanded frame, a self-conscious heir to Rome that refused to admit the western half had truly fallen. Its capital, Constantinople, rose on the Bosporus like a fortified lighthouse, its walls triple-layered, its harbors crowded with ships, its great church of Hagia Sophia vaulting upward in a dome that seemed to defy gravity. Here, Roman law was refined into the Justinianic Code, a monumental attempt to gather, edit, and clarify centuries of decrees into a single authoritative record that would echo in later European legal systems. Greek learning remained a living presence. Scholars copied manuscripts, debated theology in technical Greek, and preserved authors whose names would otherwise have vanished into the sea mist of history. Further east and south, a different story of empire and intellect unfolded. From the 7th century, Islamic caliphates expanded with startling speed, their rule stretching from Central Asia to the Atlantic. In Baghdad, the Abbasid caliphs sponsored the Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, where scholars in multiple languages attempted a daring intellectual flight to gather all knowledge of the known world under one roof. Mathematicians refined algebra, introduced new numerals, and calculated planetary motions with a precision that put earlier attempts to shame. Physicians such as Al-Razi and Ibn Sina dissected case histories, tested remedies, and wrote medical encyclopedias that would become standard references. Astronomers charted the heavens from observatories in Baghdad, Cairo, and later Malaga, measuring the skies while caravans flowed beneath. On the western edge of this world, in Muslim-ruled Al-Andalus, cities such as Cordoba dazzled visitors from colder, poorer realms. Street lighting, paved roads, libraries holding hundreds of thousands of volumes, and cultivated gardens formed a setting in which philosophers, poets, and jurists argued late into the night. As stated earlier, history often advances in quiet, cumulative steps. Here, those steps left records in paper, ink, and stone. Between these centers and Latin Christendom, the traffic of ideas did not move in a simple straight line. Greek philosophical and scientific texts, preserved in Byzantium,
passed into Arabic translation in the Islamic world, where commentators expanded upon Aristotle, Galen, and others. Centuries later, in places such as Toledo and Palermo, translation schools rendered those Arabic versions into Latin, sometimes with Jewish scholars as intermediaries. The result was a layered conversation across languages and faiths. Aristotle read through Ibn Rushd, Galen filtered through Arabic medical commentary, Euclid reintroduced by way of Baghdad. Needless to say, this was not a world sealed into religious compartments. Trade, diplomacy, and conflict stitched these realms together. Venetian merchants crowded Constantinople's harbors, chasing pepper, silk, and sugar. Envoys crossed borders bearing letters, gifts, and sometimes veiled threats. The Crusades, remembered for bloodshed, also created corridors through which technologies and tastes traveled. Paper-making methods, navigational instruments, citrus fruits, and even the game of chess. The flight had been an eventful one. Every armed pilgrimage also became an accidental seminar in foreign customs, medicine, and fortification. Yet when Renaissance humanists later spoke of a dark age, much of this light lay outside their chosen frame. They praised a reborn Rome and Athens while downplaying the empires that had kept Roman law alive, advanced Greek science, or carried those texts back into Latin. The question lingers, quietly subversive. When later scholars painted the centuries before them as a long night, whose lamps were they ignoring? And what did that selective memory allow them to claim about their own brilliance? Why Renaissance humanists needed a dark age? History is often a theater of lighting tricks, where one age steps forward into the spotlight only after dimming the stage around it. In today's compilation, this becomes sharply visible in the moment Renaissance humanists in Italy began to talk about a long, murky interval between themselves and ancient Rome. These scholars, poets and artists in Florence, Venice and Rome were astonished by the manuscripts and statues emerging from monastic libraries and buried villas. Cicero's speeches, Virgil's verses, marble torsos and serene faces from Athens and the imperial capital seemed to them the record of a lost golden age. Surrounded by crumbling ruins and living under merchant princes and popes, they framed their own generation as a daring flight back toward that brilliance, a conscious attempt to revive an extraordinary world that had supposedly vanished. To make that claim convincing, the centuries in between needed to look dim. Thinkers such as Petrarch spoke of a middle time, an age of rust and forgetfulness, wedged between ancient clarity and their own awakening. By portraying the millennium from the fall of Rome to their present as a dark age, they cast themselves as heroic pilots, breaking through cloud into sunlight. The metaphor was not innocent. It turned a complex, uneven period into a convenient backdrop, a long night that made their dawn appear inevitable and uniquely radiant. As stated earlier, such narratives travel well when they flatter those in power. Humanist curricula spread through elite schools, universities, and courts. Latin classes taught that true eloquence belonged to Cicero and those who imitated him. Painters filled walls with Plato, Caesar, and winged allegories of Renaissance, while medieval figures were pushed to the margins or caricatured as armored brutes and superstitious peasants. Later, Enlightenment writers adopted this script, sharpening it further. Reason and science belonged to ancients and moderns, while the intervening centuries were recast as a long failed attempt, an abortive flight that had stalled before finally relaunching in the 17th and 18th centuries. Needless to say, this erased a great deal. Monasteries that had copied Greek philosophy, engineers who raised cathedrals and bridges, jurists refining Roman law, merchants opening trade routes from Flanders to China, physicians translating Arabic medical texts into Latin, all faded into a vague gloom. Beyond Europe, the framing was even harsher. While Italian humanists praised their reborn Athens, they largely ignored the Abbasid Golden Age, Song and Ming China, or the scholars of Timbuktu, whose libraries were anything but dark. The result
was a story in which light belonged to a few chosen moments and places, and everything else became background shadow. Yet every period, including the present, has its own way of brightening itself by dimming others. If Renaissance humanists needed a dark age to magnify their role, what eras or regions are quietly being cast into shadow today? And what will later historians uncover there when the lighting changes once again? If you woke up medieval tomorrow, shock therapy. History is often lit from a distance, but the beam rarely falls on the ordinary morning. As stated earlier, the so-called Dark Ages appear most distorted when reduced to battles and plagues. To test those shadows, the scene shifts to a single day, in a single life, under a low timbered roof somewhere in Europe, around the year 1300. The first sensation is cold. Breath smokes in the half-dark, mingling with the sting of old ash and damp wool. The room is crowded. Parents, children, perhaps a grandparent, all sharing one space with a few chickens and the faint ammonia reek from the animals penned just beyond a thin wall. There is no switch to reach for, no soft glow of a screen. Fire must be coaxed from embers, and the only alarm is a neighbor's voice, a rooster, or the distant toll of church bells marking the approach of dawn. Clothing waits at the bedside, not in a wardrobe, but in a folded heap. Rough linen against the skin, heavy wool over it, the same garments worn day after day. Privacy, in the modern sense, barely exists. Dressing, washing, arguing, praying, all unfold within earshot of others. Outside, the lane is mud and manure. The air carries smoke from hearths, the sourness of unwashed bodies, the iron tang of nearby forges. In today's compilation, the flight into this world is not through a heroic aviator or a record-breaking attempt, but through the ordinary senses of an ordinary person. Then, a cut. A phone alarm blares in a heated bedroom. Water runs invisibly through pipes. Coffee drips into a machine with a quiet hiss. Traffic hums beyond double glazing. The pattern interrupts itself, and the camera returns to the medieval morning. No plumbing, only a bucket and a shared latrine. No commute by bus or train, only a walk to the fields, the workshop, or the market, guided again by bells that divide the day into prayer and labor. Breakfast is coarse bread, perhaps a smear of cheese or onion. Later meals lean on grains and vegetables, with meat as an occasional guest. When meat or fish appear, they arrive salted hard or steeped in vinegar, chased by herbs and spices that mask preservation more than they display luxury. At night, darkness is almost complete. A single candle or rushlight throws a tiny circle of gold. Beyond it, the world dissolves into uncertainty and superstition. Socially, the hierarchy is unmistakable. Lords, clergy, and townsmen command. Peasants obey. Gender roles are rigidly defined in law and custom, yet within those frames there are negotiations. Women managing households and markets, men bound to seasonal work, both constrained by expectations of obedience and honor. Speech is saturated with religious language. Oaths, contracts, and court records invoke God, saints, and the church as naturally as modern legal texts cite clauses and codes. Yet beneath these differences, familiar currents run. Gossip curls through doorways. Jokes pass around the ale bench. Parents fear illness for their children and grieve when those fears are fulfilled. Ambition drives an apprentice toward mastery, a merchant toward distant fairs, a minor noble toward favor at court. The desire for meaning and security turns faces toward relics, processions, and sermons in ways that echo modern searches for purpose. Needless to say, the comparison raises a quiet question. If progress is measured only in comfort and control over the environment, what is gained, and what forms of dependence replace the old ones? The next section follows that question outward. From this cramped interior to the larger networks of trade, learning, and power that slowly pull this world toward what later ages would call a renaissance. Was the Middle Ages really dark?
A verdict in 3 questions. History is often painted in stark contrasts, as if centuries can be reduced to a room with the lights switched either on or off. In today's compilation, the so-called Dark Ages sit at the center of that metaphor, inviting a verdict. To approach it, 3 guiding questions emerge from the stories already traced. What was known and preserved, how people lived and died, and how violent this world truly was. The first question concerns knowledge. As stated earlier, monasteries appeared on the map not merely as spiritual refuges, but as engines of preservation. In scriptoria lit by oil lamps, monks copied not only scripture, but also the works of Augustine, Boethius, and, crucially, long-dead Greek and Roman authors. In an age when a single manuscript could cost more than a house, those slow, repetitive strokes kept entire libraries from vanishing. Over time, cathedral schools and then universities at Bologna, Paris, and Oxford turned that hoarded learning outward, debating Aristotle, Roman law, and medicine. The flight had been an eventful one for ideas, from crumbling Roman villas to cloistered cells, then into lecture halls where masters argued about the motion of the heavens and the nature of the soul. The second question turns to daily life. A medieval village followed the rhythm of seasons and bells, its record written in harvests, births, and burials rather than in parchment. Diets leaned heavily on bread, pottage, and vegetables, with meat far rarer than later romantic images suggest. Festivals, saints' days, and market fairs punctuated the hard labor, filling grey months with color, music, and processions. Yet beneath this patterned existence lay harsh realities. High infant mortality, periodic famine, and medical understanding that mixed herbal remedies with prayer and bloodletting. Social hierarchies were rigid, the peasant bound to lord and land, the artisan to guild, the nun to convent. Religious persecution could flare against heretics or minorities, reminding all that belief in this world was not a private affair, but a public risk. The third question confronts violence. Castles, once imagined as romantic backdrops, appear instead as instruments of control, their towers overlooking fields and roads. Knights trained from youth for mounted combat, their charges breaking infantry lines in scenes far removed from choreographed duels on screen. Warfare was brutal, marked by sieges, scorched fields, and at times, massacres. Yet when compared with the mechanized slaughter of later centuries, this violence feels both intimate and constrained. Its reach limited by terrain, logistics, and the endurance of horses and men. In world terms, the Middle Ages were no monopoly on cruelty. They were simply one chapter in a longer blood-streaked story. Taken together, these 3 questions suggest that dark and light are misleading verdicts. In this era, monasteries guarded ancient texts, while new universities and crafts quietly innovated. Trade networks threaded from Italian ports to northern fairs. Art filled churches with painted saints and bright glass. And at the same time, plague, war, and persecution cut lives brutally short. This was a world that inherited broken pieces of Rome, and almost without intending to, laid foundations for modern banking, law, and education. In today's compilation, the attempt to judge it with a single word begins to falter. Needless to say, the story does not end here. The same pressures already visible, expanding trade, restless cities, religious strain, and the spread of cheaper print, are about to collide. In the next section,
That collision will fracture this medieval order, sending scholars, merchants, and rulers into a new contest over power and truth that later ages will celebrate as Renaissance and fear as Reformation. An extraordinary turning point still waiting just beyond the horizon. Threads through time. How medieval choices shape your life. That horizon is closer than it appears, because its shadows fall across the present. History is like a long flight through cloud and clear air. The medieval centuries are not a dead zone on the radar, but the stretch of sky where many instruments on the modern dashboard were first tested, repaired, and reluctantly trusted. In today's compilation, we explore those hidden connections. Consider the university. As stated earlier, restless cities and cheaper print stirred new debates. But long before modern campuses, medieval scholars had created self-governing corporations of masters and students in places such as Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. Their charters, gowns, lectures, and examinations survive in altered form wherever degrees are awarded and academic titles defended. The St. Scholastica Day riot, born from bad wine and wounded pride, was not only a brawl, it was an early record of a town forced to acknowledge that this new institution would wield extraordinary power for centuries. Alongside the university stood the guild. Medieval craft and merchant guilds regulated training, prices, and quality, defended members in court, and guarded secrets as carefully as any modern patent office. Their echoes are heard whenever professional associations license doctors, lawyers, or pilots, or when unions negotiate wages. Even the humbler manorial court, where peasants argued about hedges, grazing rights, and broken promises before a lord's steward, helped shape expectations that local disputes should be settled by known customs and recorded decisions. Beneath the robes of today's magistrates and local judges, that older village forum still flickers. Medieval merchants, meanwhile, were forced into financial innovation by distance and danger. To move silver across mountains or seas invited robbery and ruin, so letters of credit, bills of exchange, and early banking houses emerged in Italian and northern cities. A trader in Florence could pay in one currency and have a partner in Bruges release funds in another, a solo attempt to make capital travel without risking its physical flight. Modern credit cards, international transfers, and the invisible architecture of global commerce rest on principles hammered out in those counting houses and fairs. The intellectual cargo was just as significant. Monasteries and cathedral schools copied worn manuscripts of Aristotle, Cicero, and Euclid, preserving texts that might otherwise have vanished. Scholastic debates in lecture halls over how faith and reason could coexist, whether nature obeyed stable laws, and what counted as proof, created habits of argument later reused by scientists and philosophers. When the scientific revolution challenged inherited authorities, it did so using tools of logic and commentary refined in medieval classrooms. Cultural legacies are even harder to escape. Fairy tales of enchanted forests, cursed castles, and humble youths tested by trials draw on medieval storytelling and older pre-Christian fears. Modern fantasy worlds, from armored orders to dark towers, recycle imagery first sharpened in chansons de geste and saints' lives. Gothic cathedrals, once painted and crowded with relics, still dictate skylines. Their pointed arches and ribbed vaults inspired later revival styles that decorate banks, parliaments, and train stations. Even the calendar of holidays, Christmas and Easter layered over solstice and spring rites, harvest festivals, saints' days turned into regional celebrations, owes much to medieval compromises between Christian ritual and older seasonal rhythms. A simple walk through a city reveals these ghosts. A college crest, a guild hall turned museum, a court building crowned with blindfolded justice, a bank in neo-Gothic stone, a fantasy poster in a shop window.
Needless to say, the so-called Dark Ages never truly ended. They were absorbed. In the next section, the focus shifts to those moments when this inherited framework fractured under pressure, and when reformers, heretics, and visionaries tried to rewrite the rules of a world they had unknowingly inherited from the medieval past. Rewriting the Dark Ages. Your turn to judge history is often introduced as a grand cathedral of dates and names, but it also lives as a set of half-remembered images. For many viewers, the phrase Middle Ages once summoned the same mental picture. A grey village sunk in mud. A world of ignorance. A permanent low rumble of war drums in the distance. In today's compilation, after so many extraordinary episodes from different centuries, that first sketch now stands beside a more crowded canvas. Consider the contrast. The earlier image showed only darkness. The newer one holds a dimly lit but busy landscape. A peasant bends over a narrow strip of land, yet that field sits under a calendar of saints' days, harvest rites, and winter feasts. A monk in a cold scriptorium copies a text by candlelight, but the page under his hand might be Aristotle, Augustine, or a medical recipe that traveled from the Islamic world. A knight in patched mail rides out under a banner, not toward a glamorous duel, but into a chaotic melee that sounded, smelled, and felt far from the polished armor of modern film. As stated earlier, the label Dark Ages did not fall from the sky. It was crafted. Renaissance humanists, eager to present their own age as a rebirth, cast the centuries behind them as a long night. Later writers repeated the phrase until it hardened into a record, an easy shorthand that obscured more than it revealed. To think like historians is to treat that label as a source in itself, to ask who coined it, what they wanted, and whose experiences disappeared in the attempt. So a few deliberate mental exchanges suggest themselves. Instead of a world frozen in place, imagine one slowly changing, season by season, charter by charter, as trade routes stretch from village tracks to Mediterranean ports. Instead of isolation, picture an interconnected web in which a plague ship alters wages in a distant town, or a single manuscript carried across the Alps reshapes a monastery's library. Needless to say, the flight of ideas in this period did not require an aviator. It relied on pilgrims, merchants, friars, and the occasional ambitious noble. There is also room for a more personal experiment. Faced with this revised landscape, which medieval role would seem most bearable for a single week, and which would appear utterly intolerable? A peasant, bound to soil yet anchored in a tight-knit community. A monk whose silence shelters books that could cost more than a house. A knight whose honor depends on violence. A merchant tracing uncertain routes through a fractured world. Or a noble balancing privilege with constant political risk. Each position offers a different vantage point on the same age. In a sense, the comment section beneath this video functions as a modern village square, a noisy space where interpretations meet, collide, and occasionally reconcile. There, the old image of the Dark Ages stands beside newer attempts, and the story of this period continues to be renegotiated in public. In the next section, attention turns from these broad impressions to more focused confrontations, when particular crises forced contemporaries to decide what, precisely, from the medieval inheritance would be preserved, reformed, or abandoned altogether. From Dark Ages to next episode, choose our next journey. From those debates over memory and inheritance, the compilation's long arc returns to the ground level of experience. Fields and forges, cloisters and courts, the ordinary and the extraordinary sharing the same narrow streets. Across 2 hours, this flight through the medieval world has moved from village tracks to monastery scriptoria, from fortress walls to plague carts,
from candlelit cathedrals to the clatter of the first printing presses that began to redraw the map of knowledge. In today's compilation, the record of that 1,000-year span has not been a single tale of gloom, but a mosaic of attempts, failures, and sudden advances.
The peasant tied to a few muddy acres, the monk copying a fragile manuscript, the knight testing armor in a training yard, the physician puzzled by unseen contagion, the printer feeding damp paper under creaking beams. Each stood inside what later centuries dismissed as the Dark Ages, yet their world was anything but empty. As stated earlier, historians now hesitate over that old label, not out of politeness, but because so many sources insist on their own light. Charters from bustling towns, sermons shaped for crowded marketplaces, legal disputes over trade routes, or the quiet record of a monastery's library catalogue, all show a society arguing, adapting, and imagining. Needless to say, many shadows remained: warfare, famine, persecution. But the contrast matters more than the caricature. For those who wish to step further into these hidden rooms of history, the next journey waits just beyond this closing frame. The next episode may follow the Black Death as it crosses seas and frontiers, tracing how a single pandemic could tear open social hierarchies. It may turn inward to castles and warfare, testing film images against the logistics of siege engines, supply lines, and terrified garrison soldiers. It may examine medieval medicine, where prayer, herbal practice, and early experiment met at the bedside. Or it may pursue the Crusades, where faith, ambition, and misunderstanding collided on roads stretching from village chapels to distant walls. Viewers are invited to choose the route. In the comments, a simple vote for plague, castles, medicine, or crusades will help determine which door opens first, and a few words about which corner of the medieval world proved most surprising will add new perspectives to this ongoing attempt to redraw the age. If the phrase Dark Ages still circulates among friends or relatives as an easy dismissal, this episode can serve as a quiet challenge. Sharing the video offers an opportunity to test that inherited image against the evidence of villages busy with seasonal work, monasteries preserving fragile texts, merchants carrying silks and stories across continents, and artisans raising stone vaults that still dominate skylines. As the screen fades, imagine a great cathedral at night. Some windows are dark, others burn with colored light, and from outside the pattern seems uneven, almost random. History is rarely a single switch flipped from darkness to brilliance. It is a shifting mosaic of small, flickering stories. The next episode will simply choose one more window and let it glow a little brighter.